The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled The Future of Housing in America, 50 Years of HUD and Its Impact on Federal Housing. I now recognize myself for 3 minutes to give an opening statement. In launching the war on poverty, President Johnson told us its purpose was, quote, not only to relieve the symptom of poverty, but to cure it and above all to prevent it. One of the chief weapons in this war was to be the Department of Housing and Urban Development, a cabinet-level agency President Johnson signed into law 50 years ago this month. In its history, HUD has clearly achieved good. It has made commendable progress to aggressively fight immoral and illegal racial discrimination in housing. It has proven vital to many of our low-income elderly and disabled citizens and has undoubtedly made poverty more tolerable. But it has also dramatically failed to meet President Johnson's noble aspirations, much less deliver any measurable results. In fact, poverty levels are largely unchanged since HUD's creation. With some notable exceptions, HUD's public housing projects are typically any city's most despairing places, where generations of poverty-stricken families are warehoused and sealed off from the best schools, best job opportunities, and safest neighborhoods. It is simply not enough to marginally improve the lives of the able-bodied poor through perpetual government dependency. A caring and compassionate society must always have a ladder of opportunity on which everyone can climb. Thus, our collective goal cannot be limited to helping people tolerate poverty. It must be to help them escape poverty. And whether I've met them at the Salvation Army Women's Shelter, Habitat for Humanity homes, or the Jubilee Center in my native Dallas, I know that is the aspiration of our low-income brothers and sisters. We must help them find ways for them to provide for their families, to conquer generational cycles of dependency, and to have the opportunity to enjoy the dignity of meaningful work. Most importantly, they must have a chance to enjoy a quality not measured in dollars and cents, the pursuit of happiness. We can no longer measure success by taxpayer dollars expended and new HUD programs launched. Measuring success based on how many Americans are standing in line for welfare checks versus earning growing paychecks is a sure sign that the system has failed. And now is also the time to acknowledge this fundamental truth. There can be no real progress in the cause of affordable housing without recognition that government policies are often the impediment. First, by making housing more expensive, up to 30% according to some studies due to regulatory and zoning restrictions. Secondly, by shrinking paychecks and harming economic growth through poor policies. And thirdly, by denying educational choice for families to escape failing schools and improve themselves. This hearing will be the first in a series on the future of housing in America, where we will investigate questions that ought to matter to all members concerned for the dignity and well-being of the poor among us. What are the precise problems HUD is trying to solve? Why doesn't it seem to work? How should we measure success, and what should we be doing in the 21st century? A decent society has a moral responsibility to help make affordable housing accessible for the elderly, the disabled, those who cannot provide for their dependents, and those who find themselves in hard times and in need of a second chance. The question here is not should we honor that commitment, but how do we best honor that commitment in the 21st century, and can we work together on a bipartisan basis to do that? I now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you and our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Chairman and members, I just returned from a homeless program. I was there this morning with a few of my colleagues. Mr. Cleaver was there and Mr. Green was there. We visited N Street Village, a homeless service provider, footsteps from the halls of our Capitol. At this hearing, as this hearing seeks to examine the effectiveness of HUD programs over the last 50 years, I thought it would be important to help make the connection between what we have talked about here in committee and what HUD is doing to support providers like N Street Village working on the front lines of our nation's effort to end homelessness. This morning, we spoke with women struggling to find work and fighting to overcome addiction, physical and mental illness, and abusive situations. What we saw today is how HUD programs directly touch and impact the lives of America's most vulnerable. We also saw that contrary to the many assertions we've heard about dysfunction and ineffectiveness at this agency, a rather ironic charge given productivity levels here in Congress. Mr. Chairman, in the wake of a foreclosure crisis that pushed as many as 11 million families out of their homes, a fully funded HUD is needed now more than ever before. This is an agency that, in addition to reducing veterans' homelessness across the nation by 33%, currently supports 1.2 million affordable housing units for low-income families through the HOME program, including almost 500,000 units for the first-time home buyers in rural and urban communities alike. This is an agency that over the last 50 years has provided housing assistance to tens of millions of families, 35 million in the last 20 years alone. This is an agency that has ensured that 44 million families have access to the American dream by ensuring they have mortgages that they can actually afford. Without question, HUD is the backbone of our nation's safety net. Today, many of our members have provided examples of HUD at work in their districts. These pictures demonstrate the transformative ability of HUD programs, particularly the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, which has infused over $7 billion into local communities to rehabilitate foreclosed homes and breathe new life into distressed neighborhoods in every corner of this great nation. However, this good work sometimes continues to be misunderstood or undermined by harmful cuts to these programs. And so I think this is time for us to truly focus on the good that HUD has done and commit ourselves to dealing with problems such as homelessness that really can be addressed. In addition to the visit that we made this morning, last week I was at Vermont Village, a project that has been developed in my district with the partnership of the private sector. We had Chase Bank involved. We had a private developer. We had the County of LA. We had another nonprofit. We had Enterprise. They all came together and built a wonderful unit, and it is serving homeless veterans. And the veterans were there, some in their wheelchairs. They were so proud of all of these opportunities that are being provided with the help and direction of HUD. And so what I wish, Mr. Chairman, is that we could focus in a bipartisan way on what we can do from this committee in support of HUD to provide housing and home opportunities for the least of these. I believe that it is possible. In Los Angeles, homelessness has risen 12%. We have declared a state of emergency. The county and the city are coming together and combining resources, but they need help from us. And so I appreciate this hearing, but I appreciate that we should actually put more focus on what we can do for the homeless and for the least of these in providing a basic safety net for those who need our help so badly. I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, chairman of our Housing and Insurance Subcommittee, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The nation's housing system is struggling and in some instances failing. Since 2002, the federal government has thrown more than $550 billion at HUD. Still, Los Angeles has seen a 12% increase in homelessness over the past year. In New York City alone, there are roughly 122,000 families on the Section 8 wait list. When the city of St. Louis opened its wait list in 2007, the Housing Authority received more than 27,000 applications in 1 week. Not until late April did St. Louis County open its wait list again for the first time since 2010. While we continue to see the need to grow and opportunities stall, we experienced a dramatic increase in federal policies that drive up the cost of housing and impose an onslaught of red tape keeping people in the private sector out of affordable housing. Our federal housing policies make no sense. Since Secretary Castro spent the last year talking about all he will do to reform housing, To date, we've seen very little in the matter of dramatic advances in HUD's ability to serve, and no new metrics by which HUD can measure its success. One has to wonder if there is any success to report at all. The time to talk about it is what is needed is over. It's time to reject political rhetoric and push ourselves to do something to help people in need. I recently introduced H.R. 3700, the Housing Opportunity Through Modernization Act. This bill is composed of non-controversial provisions that aim to clear out the regulatory underbrush. Yesterday's subcommittee hearing showed there is a tremendous bipartisan support for that effort. I hope we can continue the collaboration in bringing bolder changes that are needed at HUD. Let's work together to create an opportunity and choice in housing. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Today we welcome the testimony of the Honorable Orlando Cabrera, who is today of counsel to Squire Patton and Boggs. He has previously served as the president of an affordable housing developer and is HUD's Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing. He is a graduate of the University of Michigan and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Ms. Renee Glover is the founder and managing member of the Catalyst Group. She has previously served as the president and chief executive officer of the Atlanta Housing Authority for almost 20 years. She is also chair of Habitat for Humanity International and has worked as an attorney in private practice. Ms. Glover holds degrees from Boston, Yale, and Fisk universities. Mr. Howard Husock is the vice president of research and publications at the Manhattan Institute. He has previously served as a director at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and has authored numerous publications relating to the nonprofit sector and on U.S. housing and urban policy. Mr. Husock is a graduate of Boston University. Finally, Dr. Xavier Briggs is the vice president of economic opportunity and assets at the Ford Foundation. Dr. Briggs also holds an appointment as professor of sociology and planning at MIT and previously served as an associate director in the White House Office of Management and Budget, as well as in HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research. Dr. Briggs is a graduate of Columbia, Harvard, and Stanford universities. For those who have not testified before, each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Please make sure you turn on the microphone. Green means go, yellow means you have a minute, red means it's time to wrap up. Mr. Cabrera, you are now recognized for a summary of your testimony.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. Thank you, Chairman Hensarling, Ranking Member Waters, and members of the committee. Mr. Chairman, I ask that my written statement be entered for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to testify. I approached this a bit differently, knowing who was going to be on this panel. The folks to my left are all people I know or know of. Two of them in particular are both professional and personal friends. And they speak to issues that I think are critically important, but that I have less experience in. So, for example, Renee ran a housing authority. Javier was a policy-driven person at HUD entirely, and Mr. Husock knows a lot more about markets. I decided that I would bore everybody and go inside baseball. And inside baseball means to focus on metrics. The overarching theme of this testimony is not so much focused on HUD's past or previous impact. Over the decades, HUD and its many arms have undoubtedly impacted housing policy in both positive and negative ways. If we know that HUD has impacted federal policy unevenly, it has, I propose that there is a value in exploring how we can achieve better future housing policy outcomes. Better serving all Americans, but particularly the elderly, the disabled, very low income, and low income Americans should always remain at the core of our nation's housing policy. Moving towards a legislative policy that is relevant to our current century, not the 20th century, would be a great step in helping HUD evolve. Change is inevitable for HUD. Its personnel is aging, and many are retiring. Important institutional memory has been lost already. Similarly, its current infrastructure is also aging, making it harder still to capture important and relevant data. Many believe that one way to improve HUD's impact would be to begin new programs or housing solutions or do away with them. Perhaps, but my starting point would be a bit different. I believe that the way to improve HUD's impact is through the more adept and intensive use of technology. More specifically, a critical area at HUD that deserves focus, careful design, and investment is information technology. Providing HUD with the appropriate tools that relate to our century's housing policy model and needs will produce better outcomes for residents and taxpayers. There are 3 essential steps to improving outcomes. Define your desired result, know more about how to measure that result, and do what needs to be done faster and better than was previously the case. In HUD's case, the first step should be to decide that HUD needs to break away from the silo organizational mold that HUD uses currently into a more fluid and flexible organization. HUD has always depended on silos out of statutory and operational necessity. Those silos were probably appropriately designed organizational components decades ago. But those silos are now impediments to improving HUD's capacity to more effectively serve our nation. Essentially, HUD has 4 basic roles. HUD allocates resources, ensures financial products, and regulates certain stakeholders. Finally, HUD is charged with policing and prosecuting fair housing violations. That is a relatively narrow set of tasks that is currently bundled in a far more expansive organizational setting at HUD. HUD's organization and activities should be integrated into an information technology platform that allows it to more effectively perform those 4 basic roles in a more seamless manner than is currently the case. Secondly, the American taxpayer would benefit if HUD developed more relevant metrics than those currently being used. More specifically, Congress should begin by first providing HUD with the tools that HUD needs to capture not just better and relevant data, but complex, fluid data that can lead to defining better outcomes for very low and low-income Americans. Integrating technology would, for example, allow us to improve people's lives by measuring and determining better educational achievements, healthcare services, and other important services in a more dynamic way than is currently possible. That would mean better outcomes for residents and better efficiencies for the federal government. HUD desperately needs the appropriate tools to obtain usable, scalable, shareable, and relevant information that all of HUD's stakeholders can use. Providing HUD with the right data tools and maintaining those tools will go further towards creating a more efficient system than nearly any other investment. I believe that it would be time well worth the effort to match desired housing policy outcomes in a new century with the new century's information technology tools needed to appropriately achieve those outcomes. Thank you again for your invitation to testify. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, and without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. Ms. Glover, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Thank you. And Chairman Henseling and Ranking Member Waters, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. I think it's very important when you think about the issue of housing to remember that America is a nation of immigrants. And so new people will continue to come and new challenges are going to arise. And so poverty is not a static condition. It is also a function of what happens in the economy and in the larger social setting. So I think when you look at how we're making progress, we have to put it into the context of what's going on in history and also in the economy, because we made great progress over the years, and I think if we take an objective measure of the programs that have been implemented to date, we'll see that many of the families who've been assisted have gone on, have made progress, and are contributing to our country. But the Great Recession, we cannot underestimate the impact that it had on the housing programs and how families are faring. And I think it's now universally accepted that there is income disparity, and so that has implications in terms of what type of investment we need to make to have a strong America. One of the things that I have enjoyed is with serving Habitat for Humanity, we have observed that not only here in America, but all over the world, that housing is at the center of everything that is needed to have a great society. It is the center of great education outcomes, healthy families, healthy children, and there are no great nations without great communities. So the question is, what should we be doing as a country to rebuild? Because there's no question that America is the greatest nation in the world, but how do we help everyone in the country achieve the American dream? And Dr. Martin Luther King challenges us to build the beloved community here on earth, and that means all of us are God's hands, feet, and heart to rebuild the society. So when you think about that, we cannot afford to leave one child behind, and the question is, how do we go about doing it? So in my testimony, I mentioned that there have been several big ideas that have been put forth and have been implemented successfully. But no program is perfect because human beings are doing the implementation. So the question is, can we lift out the lessons learned and best practices to see what has worked and then do more of what has worked and less of the things that haven't worked? So what are the things that we've learned? Well, first of all, we know that every American needs a decent home and a great community. Secondly, we know that home ownership, where feasible, builds stability and helps build wealth. And we've also learned that government must be a part of the solution, but the question is, how do you go about doing that? And so we've learned that providing mobility and choice is important, that ending concentrated poverty is important, and I think the Hope 6 program and the Promise Neighborhood, Promise Zones programs have shown that with people coming together and connecting the dots, we can make a huge difference. I'm sure that in all of your different localities, you have seen that with a small investment and working in public-private partnerships and leveraging private resources and creating environments where the foundation community, the families themselves, and the larger community come together, we can create additional communities of opportunity. We've also learned that the Section 8 voucher, if it is implemented appropriately, it can provide access to communities of opportunity. And that's because the families who are using these resources want better lives for themselves and their children. I know that with 100% certainty. The other thing is we need to incent innovation, and I think through the Moving to Work deregulation program, we have seen that that has been very effective in incenting innovation and creativity and leverage. And so I'd simply say, let's continue to invest in our families and in our country, and working together, there's nothing that we can't do. So I appreciate the time, and thank you for the opportunity.
Mr. Husock, you're now recognized for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Henserling and Ranking Member Waters, for the invitation. As we reflect on the 50th anniversary of the founding of HUD, the Chairman is quite correct that President Johnson focuses hopes on uplifting the poor. That should mean helping as many of those of low income as practical, ensuring that low-income housing be in good condition, and helping the poor move up toward the middle class. On these counts, HUD's housing assistance today is falling short. There's little doubt, of course, that HUD does serve the poor, often the very poor. Half of households living in one or more of the 1 million plus public housing apartments or 2 million plus housing choice voucher units earn less than $10,000 a year. Many are not, however, moving up the economic ladder. HUD data shows that the median tenure in public and subsidized housing is more than 9 years, 4 years longer than the time limit for cash public assistance. In New York City, that figure is 17 years. Put it this way, the face of HUD is the face of long-term poverty in the United States. In part, that's a result of the way that we've structured the rules of the system. And I hope to offer some suggestions that will have some bipartisan appeal to improve that situation. First, a little bit more background. Both public housing and voucher tenants who work hard to increase their income face what amount to high marginal tax rates. Unlike private market tenants who sign a lease at a fixed rent, tenants in HUD's affordable housing must pay rent equal to 30% of their income. That means the more they earn, the higher their rent. Just as bad, our subsidized housing system often consigns the poor to live in the sort of conditions that public housing was specifically designed to replace. In New York, for instance, a 2014 report by the city's Community Service Society noting mounting resident outcry about elevator breakdowns, water leaks, untreated mold, said that the housing authority should qualify as the city's largest and worst landlord. A 2010 report by Apt Associates found that the public housing system's capital needs as a whole topped $21 billion. It's fortunate, then, that there are important green shoots of reform among local housing authorities, shoots which the Congress and HUD should strongly encourage. As Renee Glover mentioned, moving to work, a waiver program that has been to date limited to just a few localities, which allows the flexibility authorities need. A 2014 report by Apt Associates found that 20 of 34 moving to work authorities had changed their rent rules to encourage self-sufficiency. 11 have adopted work requirements, 8 have adopted time limits for some new tenants, all with a goal toward encouraging upward mobility. In San Bernardino, California, the Housing Authority, in explaining why it's asked for short-term assistance, emphasizes twin goals: making room for families who qualify for aid and have faced long waiting lists, and helping current tenants outgrow the need for help. Self-sufficiency should be the goal, it says. Incomes among those admitted to the authority under time limits have risen by more than 12%, employment by more than 17%. I know that in Atlanta, work participation went from under 20% to over 60%. Spreading a moving to work approach to all, or at least many, of the 3,000 plus public housing authorities would help align our housing policy with our overall social policy. There are other imaginative innovations going on. In New York, Mayor Bill de Blasio has announced plans to begin to lease underused public housing open land for new private apartment construction, with ground lease payments available to fund the system's desperate maintenance backlog. The fledgling HUD Rental Assistance Demonstration Program can be a means through which authorities avoid being penalized when they save money. That happens when they reduce operating costs and find their subsidy is reduced the next year. A guaranteed fixed per unit HUD annual payment can be used as a bond payment guarantee that can bring in private investment capital to do such things as upgrade antiquated heating systems that hemorrhage money. At its 50th anniversary, it's time for HUD to think about how it can become not just a funder of housing, but an agency that can enable and encourage some of the reforms that I've discussed. At the same time, it must never forsake its fair housing mission to ensure that any household that can afford a home or a rental unit not be turned away on the basis of race or ethnicity. It should also begin to encourage experimentation with new housing forms. One of the core ways to make housing affordable is to have more units on the same amount of land, density, and HUD can encourage experimentation. In short, the time is right for HUD to encourage upward mobility and to foster it and to adjust its rules so that it does so. Thank you very much.
Dr. Briggs, you're now recognized for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, do you have the microphone on?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Waters, and members of the committee. In light of HUD's 50th anniversary, I'd like to begin by putting policy goals briefly into some historical perspective. The earliest goal of federal housing policy was to help meet the needs of factory workers and their families when America entered the First World War. When public housing came along, there were additional goals. The official ones emphasized upgrading slums and providing stable, low rents to workers who had been affected by the Great Depression. But the large-scale construction that public housing program required also served the interests of the building industry and organized labor. The same mix of public and private purposes was true for FHA mortgage insurance, which has benefited millions of families, as well as the real estate industry. When HUD was created, it inherited this mix of public and private purposes, but the economic and social context for federal housing policy had begun to shift in very significant ways. First, after several decades of economic growth and broadly shared prosperity in America, cities in many parts of the country were hit with large-scale disinvestment and joblessness. And second, migration patterns had transformed the racial and economic makeup of cities profoundly. In this context, and particularly after widespread civil unrest, media accounts and major works of scholarly research began to ask whether well-intended housing policies were solving problems or making them worse. Lesson one is that these sweeping changes in America meant that HUD and its congressional overseers began to grapple with fundamental questions about the proper goals of federal housing policy, and by many measures began to swim against the tide of larger economic and social trends virtually from day one. Lesson two is that we have been set back at a great human and fiscal cost by our inability to agree enough on the goals of federal policy, let alone the most effective means of achieving those goals. Without agreement, we lack adequate commitment, and without that commitment, we struggle to make more progress. Fast forward 50 years from the founding of HUD, and this lack of agreement on fundamental goals manifests in several powerful ways. First, federal housing assistance produces enormous benefits, as you've heard, but we are not focusing enough resources or reform on the biggest problem, the structural gap between income and housing costs at the base of the American economy, especially for the lowest income households. The biggest drivers of this gap by far are local housing costs and tenant incomes, not HUD's operating capacity or practices. As wages stagnated after the 1970s, especially for those earning below the median, and as an older stock of affordable units was demolished or converted and land prices climbed significantly in many local markets, millions of the lowest income households in America came to face backbreaking rents, homelessness, or endless commutes to find affordable housing. Those two driving factors, along with the policy decision in recent years to add new vouchers to combat homelessness, especially among veterans, explain why the total cost of the voucher program, to cite one example, why it has grown. It is very much a function of our strategy since the 1970s to rely primarily on the private rental market to meet the housing needs of those who cannot afford decent housing. It is also increasingly clear that the costs of this quiet crisis of unaffordable housing show up in children's health, emotional development, educational achievement, as well as adults' health, mental health, and employment. So we pay severely, both through government spending on health, criminal justice, and other sectors, and also through lost productivity and well-being. Second, several of the most important levers for affecting the structural affordability gap lie outside HUD's budget and authority. The tax code is the most obvious example. It helps to modestly expand the supply of affordable rental housing, most directly through the low-income housing tax credit, but it also structures the rewards of work, for example, through the earned income tax credit, and it targets most federal housing aid through the mortgage interest tax deduction to the middle class and the affluent, rather than the very low-income households who face the most unaffordable costs. Third, housing assistance has not been designed or funded to act as a cure-all for poverty. In other words, housing affordability is a necessary but not a sufficient condition to produce economic mobility and self-reliance. Fourth and finally, we will exacerbate the challenges we face if we seek to expand housing assistance only within the limited geography that contains most affordable housing now. That is, we will deepen the problems associated with geographically concentrated poverty if we don't take greater steps toward greater inclusion. In closing, it's vital to make housing policy a force for self-reliance and economic mobility. To accomplish this, four things need to happen. First, we need to go beyond the HUD budget for leverage. Second, for HUD and other agencies, it's vital to make our housing delivery system as efficient and well-targeted as possible. Third, it's crucial that we support effective pro-work housing policy for households that are not elderly or disabled. Fourth and finally, we should make inclusionary housing a full and integral part of the larger agenda of federal housing policy to help states and localities encourage more balanced development and mitigate harmful segregation. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Ms. Glover, on page 7 of your testimony with respect to work, You mentioned for non-elderly, able-bodied adults, it, quote, restores dignity and is proven to be a positive game changer for families and their children. Specifically, you mentioned in your testimony the Moving to Work demonstration project, and you say, quote, has had transformational impacts and proven very effective. Would you elaborate on your views, please?
Yes, thank you. When we adopted the work requirement for non-elderly, able-bodied families, we did this in consultation with the residents who were affected by those policy changes. And what we consistently heard is that the requirement was the additional boost coupled with an investment. When we had the deregulation agreement and we also were operating under the Hope 6 grant, we were able to invest in long-term counseling and coaching to help families rebuild their resiliency, change their mindsets, and deal with the actual family problems that they were confronting. And in terms of family self-worth, we heard consistently from each of the families that work restored dignity, respect, and it also gave them the ability to have more mobility and more control over their lives. And so when I talk about game-changing impacts, this really was transformational for the families. And all of the research that has been done who have looked at this are seeing that not only did the families start out working, but if they lost their jobs, they've been able to go back into the workforce and find new jobs, and they have resiliency. And so the work success has been greater than 90% with the appropriate support and the right policies. In terms of moving to work being transformational, it allowed agencies in their local communities, and certainly in Atlanta, working with the local players, to design programs that work. All real estate is local, and it's very hard for anyone in a central location to devise the solutions for very different geographies.
I think I heard all of the witnesses speak laudably of work programs, but specifically with respect to the Moving to Work program, just a show of hands, would each of you advocate expanding that current HUD program? Just a show of hands. Thank you. Mr. Husock, you actually had some data, I guess, with respect to at least one of the Moving to Work programs. San Bernardino, incomes rose 12%, employment by 17%. Have you looked at other Moving to Work programs? Is the data similar? Would you hit the microphone, please?
I have not, but the Apt Associates report that I cite refers to a number of other programs with similar results. And as Renee Glover knows well, in Atlanta, the work participation rate was about 18% when the work requirement began and rose to over 60%. I believe that's correct, Renee.
Also, well, and again, I will note that all four witnesses raised their hand to the Moving to Work question of expansion. You mentioned, Mr. Husock, in your testimony about the, I don't know your exact phrase, but essentially punitive marginal rates for those who expand their employment opportunities. So what public policy might that suggest?
Well, I think within the Moving to Work framework, and remember, there's nothing mandatory in moving to work. I think that's the most important thing to understand. It gives flexibility to local housing authorities based on their understanding of local conditions. But in terms of that specific question, right now, if I am leasing a unit in a public housing authority, my rent goes up as my income goes up. That's a counterproductive approach. And so I think the right way to do that, to repair that, is either to allow, under Moving to Work, authorities to set fixed rents, you sign a lease just like you do in the private market, or to have I know in some authorities they've set so-called income bands. That is, within a certain framework, your rent will not go up until you earn a good deal more. That would be second best.
Time of the chair has expired. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me make sure that the record reflects that those of us on this side of the aisle, as I'm sure on that side of the aisle, all believe in work. We believe that it is important for people to have jobs. We also agree that it gives a sense of dignity and pride to work. And many of us, started working when we were 12 and 13 years old. And I, for example, started at 13 in a segregated restaurant where I cleaned tables where I couldn't eat. So let's be clear about the value of work and what we think about it, because we do not want people to leave with the impression that somehow there's a difference in what we think about work. We think that's very important. Secondly, we need to get some facts on the record. How many of you believe that HUD is important? It has done credible work in providing housing opportunities, even though you may disagree about how to do it better. How many agree that it has in 50 years been important? Okay, so let's all agree on that. How many agree that even with new technology and some of the rest of the recommendations that you may have about not increasing the rent, that if we are to deal with the unhoused population in this country, we're going to have to spend credible resources in order to do it? How many people would agree with that? Okay, thank you very much. Now, let's move to the discussion about moving to work. Who can tell me what percentage of public housing tenants are physically disabled, mentally disabled, and incapable of being put on jobs? What percentage of public housing tenants in America fall into the senior, too old to go to work, too disabled to go to work, too mentally incapacitated to go to work? Who knows that information? Mr. Briggs?
Thank you, Ranking Member Waters. The answer is a majority of housing-assisted households, particularly those on vouchers and public housing, face those barriers to work. They are either elderly or they're disabled. I've spent a good deal of time with these households and the work-ready and the working, many of them working poor but working hard. And as you said, everyone believes in the pride and the dignity that comes with work. They're struggling to make ends meet. They're juggling an awful lot. But it's extremely important, whether you're looking at moving to work, whether you're looking at moving to opportunity, or other important efforts that HUD has launched over the years, not to be confused about what's attainable for a given population.
Okay, I hate to cut you off. I only have so much time here. So one thing that we must agree on is that there are tenants in public housing, no matter what you do with move to work or anything else, can't live anyplace else but in subsidized housing, such as public housing. When we talk about seniors too old to work, when we talk about the disabled, when we talk about the mentally incompetent, when we went to this housing, this program, this homeless program today, most of the women were 60 to 70 to 75 years old, and they're not going to get hired by anybody, particularly in this market that we have, where people who are graduating from college can't find jobs. Nobody's going to hire them. How many people really understand that? That you have people who fall in this age range that are not going to get any jobs? How many people understand that this population that we are talking about is something that we have to recognize is a population that we're going to have to deal with and subsidize whether we like it or not? Now, having said that, how many of you have the statistics on move to work programs that can tell me exactly how many people who have gotten job training and have moved on to a job? Where's the data? Where are the stats? Who's got that information in this country? Yes, ma'am, Ms. Glover.
Well, there have been a number of studies done by economists and universities, and I will commit to this committee to reach out to the various networks. I think one of the problems is that the research has been done, but it's all over the country in different databases and whatever, and I think it would be magnificent if this committee could have that information through a central funnel, because I think that you will see that the policies that have allowed for innovation at the local level has yielded tremendously positive results. And
But the
I will
point
commit to get
is,
it
we
to
don't
you.
have the data, we don't have the information. Nobody knows it. People talk about how great moving to work is. Nobody can tell me exactly what has been accomplished. We don't have the information.
I will
yield
commit
back.
to get it to the committee.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukenmeyer, chairman of our Housing and Insurance Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the committee, or to the individuals testifying today. Mr. Cabrera, you had some interesting comments a while ago with regards to trying to have a different model for HUD to be able to deliver services and provide and support housing in this country. One of the problems that Secretary Castro talks about, and you mentioned as well, is the use of technology. They need some more funds to be able to do that, to do the simplest things such as certifying some of the individuals to be able to do certain things, the different groups to be able to do certain things. So that's certainly an area that we need to consider. I certainly appreciate you pointing it out. You also talk about how they need to be thinking outside the box and redo their model. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that and give us some ideas and what kind of costs you're talking about? And number two, is this something that HUD can restructure themselves, or do we legislatively have to make the changes?
Absolutely. I would like to pick up where we just left off on MTW as an example. Sure. I think the stress over MTW has to do, I hate to say this sometimes, but has to do in part with its name and in part with when it was passed. MTW, from the perspective I had, really had to do with maximum local flexibility. And in terms of innovation, I think that that's always a good thing, particularly with high-performing housing authorities. Housing authorities are state-chartered entities, not just local entities. They are created by states. They are created for the purpose of being property managers for the most part. That's what they've been since their inception, almost until very, very recently, the last decade. Those housing authorities that are more forward-looking, that have been more transformational, they tend to be MTWs. And the reason that they tend to be MTWs is because they align their local concerns first, as opposed to federal concerns. That's why MTW has value. I'm sure that if you were to ask the 30, I think we're up to 39 MTW jurisdictions, their statistics on who it is that's been moved to work, they'd tell you. But they'd also tell you, in their own plans, people who should not be working are not being compelled to do anything. Folks who are elderly or disabled aren't being compelled, because that's generally the case in most low-income housing plans in most jurisdictions. What this is really about has as much to do with how it is housing authorities operate, have them be bigger market participants than they currently are, as anything else. Housing authorities traditionally were not that. Housing authorities were essentially these trapped real estate property management concerns that had a very restrictive environment. When you untrap it, they do some pretty remarkable things. The other thing I would add is, I think one of the things that people might be missing has to do with competition. There has to be a more competitive environment in order to improve results and outcomes and make it a more efficient process. So much of what we're facing right now in terms of the debate over, because I think Javier got it right, the debate is holding up progress, but there are some places nobody debates. There are some things nobody debates. One of those things is we have to do this better. And doing things better necessarily means better and more competitive settings. So those are just two quick examples. I'm trying to make sure you can ask whatever you want of somebody else.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting. Last week, I had the opportunity to talk to some housing folks in Great Britain. They have a unique system there. They've got 17% of the people are on public housing. And they're trying to, because they can no longer afford to support that level of people in public housing, they're trying to find a way to move some of them off of the public housing rolls into their own home and figure out a way to come up, if they can come up, and this obviously doesn't work with the elderly disabled, but it does work for other folks who who are gainfully employed or can be gainfully employed. And so they get into these public-private partnerships, and some of the rent money, the subsidy, goes toward the lease purchase of the property. What do you think about something like that? Is it feasible here in this country? It doesn't solve all of the problems, but I think there is a group of people that this may come in and help. What do you think?
The British conversion of public housing to a public-private model depends upon essentially creating inclusionary areas that are thereafter sold and taxed in order to fund what we here call down payment assistance. I think from a market perspective, a lot of market participants would struggle with that. The second thing I would say that would need to be worked out is financing of something like that. It would be a very difficult thing to finance. The British system has worked marvelously for Britain because they work under a different real estate regimen than the United States. We're both common law, we're both heavily statutory, but the way that property is owned in Britain is very different than the way it's owned in the United States in many cases. It's a very difficult question to answer, but certainly, I mean, you see little pieces of that, right? In some parts of the United States, in California, there are inclusionary zoning.
I see we're out of time. I
example.
appreciate your comments. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Mr.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney, ranking member of our Capital Markets Subcommittee.
Thank the gentleman for yielding and for calling this hearing, and I thank all of the panelists for your work in this important area, and congratulations to HUD at 50. They have played an incredible role in the great city that I'm privileged to represent, New York, and I would say the whole country, in building and maintaining affordable housing. But I am distressed about the future because there's no funding. There's really no federal program, and housing is so expensive, it's hard for a city or a state to go forward with their own plan. Specifically in public housing in New York, there's over 900,000 people on a waiting list to get into public housing. There's no money for new housing. The money for maintenance is being cut back dramatically. One of you testified that the Public Housing Authority was the worst landlord in the country, but that's because they don't have the money to maintain the housing. I think it was Mr. Husock mentioned the program that Mayor de Blasio has come forward to take vacant land or land within the housing projects. The tenants there say they need that land for playgrounds and for fresh air, but and lease it, and the proposal is half of the money would go to market rate to maintain the modernization and the running of the housing authority, because they are running at a deficit, and the other half would be, quote, affordable, but the tenants in the public housing in my district tell me that it's not affordable to them. It's really a higher income than they could ever afford to be in. So I don't see the future, and even that is not a sustainable program. You're not, once all the land is leased, you don't have the money to maintain the affordable housing that is right there in public housing, which has been a huge success in New York in assisting low-income households. The only federal program that's out there now is the Housing Trust Fund, and even that is a limited one, and the first funding awards will be focused on creating affordable housing. But what we're confronting in New York and probably in the rest of the country, and I'm going to address my question to Mr. Briggs, is that we can't even afford, or the money's not there to maintain the housing that's already there. So that you do have the broken elevators and everything else. And so, where are we going? Now, the tenants are afraid that if they take their playground land and put it into affordable housing that they can't afford to live in, then the next step would be what would be in Chicago. You tear down the public housing to build, or you start renting the vacant units to market rate. And where's your very important housing goal of the Fair Housing Act, which HUD is responsible for enforcing and Congress in creating, and has been a positive thing. So I'm really concerned about this, and I think the Ford Foundation, I'm going to publicly ask you to do a study and a report on where do we go. If you're going to, it's not maintainable, it's not feasible. And the tenants are very afraid. They don't want them to take their open land, but then they think their apartments are next. It's on the water, it's beautiful housing. They think their apartments will be then, they'll say, well, we'll rent your apartment out at market rate to sustain the system. And right now, all of the money coming for maintenance of public housing is federal money now. It's all federal money, very little from the city and states. Their budgets are starved. So we face a real crisis for affordable housing. One of the most popular programs in Congress has always been the 202 Affordable Housing Program for seniors. There is now no new money for new starts. All of the money in that program is now just going to maintenance. So all of the federal housing programs are not creating new housing. They're going to maintaining the system that exists, but not doing it at an appropriate level because there's not enough money to pay for the repairs that need to take place to modernize it. So it's a crisis. I'd like to congratulate HUD on 50 years of not only providing affordable housing, but really economic development, I would say, in this great country, across this country. But I'm concerned about the future because there is no funding on a federal level. I know that the chair lady would support additional funds, and I believe many Democrats, but given the reality of the makeup of Congress, it's not going to be there. So it's a crisis, and I am asking really for the Ford Foundation and other foundations to look into what do we do as a nation for affordable housing when all of the existing programs are not being funded to go forward.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett, chairman of our Capital Markets Subcommittee.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for scheduling this very important hearing. One of the goals of this hearing to examine the extent to which HUD has improved access to affordable housing while reducing poverty and potential housing innovations designed to encourage self-sufficiency. So I'm going to begin, Mr. Chairman, maybe with this comment that may surprise you, that I'm going to agree with our ranking member on a couple of points. The ranking member made comment as to how hard it is for even college graduates to get a job. And she is absolutely right. After 7 years under the Obama administration and their economic and policies, it is still hard for a young person to go through 4 or 6, 8 years of college and come out. And still today, she is absolutely right. And it's deplorable that young people cannot find work in this environment. And so secondly, or second point, it is therefore hard for seniors to get a job as well. And I look forward to working with the ranking member to try to reverse a number of these economic policies that had a devastating impact on both seniors and college graduates. The second point that I agree with the ranking member on is the dearth of data on this matter. Now, that's a little bit confusing because someone pointed out that in a press release of the ranking member, she says that numerous studies have highlighted that moving to work demonstration programs have shortcomings. So I'm not exactly sure whether she agrees that there's a dearth of data or there is data, but let's take it from what the panels have said. There is no, Ms. Glover has said there is no coordination of the data that is out there. Is that your basic?
Yes, the
Right.
data's there. It's really funneling it.
Right, and I
into
really
the
do appreciate the
policymakers.
fact that you're willing to go out and try to bring all that to get data together so that the next hearing on this, both the ranking member and I would have a compilation on that. But you know, shouldn't the agency that's responsible for doing this have already collected the data? Hasn't the Moving to Work program, Mr. Husock, you're nodding your head. How long has this program been put in place, the Moving to Work? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
The microphone, if you could hit your microphone, please.
1998.
1998. So it's been in place that long. but we're still sitting here without a compilation of all the data. Why is that?
Congressman, it's because, as a general rule, what MTW means is that you are exempt from the Housing Act of 1937.
Yeah.
And so therefore, by virtue of that, what HUD has said, you are released from all of these things that you're responsible to us for, including reporting data.
But there are studies out there, right?
Yeah, but the studies are, how might I put this, they are somewhat, they bend one way or the other. How about
So should
that?
the public be concerned that we have a federal agency that is, allowing money to be spent and has absolutely no data to support whether those programs are working or not? If there's studies out there that are bent one way or bent another way, shouldn't the public be concerned that their government really isn't spending the money the most effective way? Because I think they are, because that goes to another point, the ranking member that I agree with as well. She says the majority, or actually, Mr. Briggs, you answered this question for her. Her question was, what's the percentage of the people in housing, public housing, that are disabled, senior citizens, can't work? And you said the majority of the people, and I think the rest of the panel agree. But if we're a country of finite resources, you all agree there's not unlimited dollars to pay for all these programs, right? If we're a country of finite resources, don't we really want to make sure that those limited resources actually get to the people that need it the most? The disabled, the senior citizen, the person who can't work because of this disastrous economy that we're in right now because of this administration. So shouldn't the limited dollars actually go to those people most in need? Ms. Glover, you seem to be ready to.
Yes, well, I wanted to
Yeah,
refine the answer.
okay.
The data in terms of the traditional measures, whatever the conditions are that are set forth in the moving to work agreements, has been gathered by the department. Over and above that, because of the transformational impact, agencies have gone out to professionals, either economists or colleges and universities, and those who look at the work to independently validate and verify the research.
And what that validation, and I get that, and what the validation would show, studies or anything else aside, is that the actual agencies that are running these programs, and even more every day, are actually asking to be putting into that program. Isn't that correct, Mr. Husock, that more people want to be into these programs than was in the past?
Absolutely. And so the reason that HUD may not have the research and studies is that that's over and above the requirements, but the required data that's needed to validate is indeed.
So thank you, Mr.
with
Chairman. I
HUD.
think that's really all the data we need, is that more people want to be into these programs than before. Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to all the panelists. Welcome to La La Land. You know, we suffer here in Washington from amnesia. For people to say that things are so bad under this administration, they're quick to forget that at the height of the economic crisis, we were losing roughly 800,000 jobs a month. Obama wasn't in the White House back then. The other day in my committee, Small Business Committee, they talk about the highest numbers of regulations issued by any administration. This one, well, I put out a report, an analysis conducted by the Washington Post that concluded that the highest numbers of regulations put out by any administration was under George W. Bush. Oh, my Lord. Anyway, so let's talk about housing. Mr. Cabrera, many housing authorities, including NYCHA, New York City Housing, plan to use an expanded RAD program to finance public housing repairs. However, we still do not know the impact of RAD on residents, and HUD has not indicated whether they will pursue an optional final RAD evaluation that will include a resident survey. Do you think it's necessary to fully understand the impact RAD has on tenants before rushing to expand the program?
I don't think that the purpose of RAD, I think the purpose of RAD is focused upon the properties more than anything else. And the reason for that is because In the case of New York, for example, there are
But
100
who lives in those properties? And
residents.
the program is to serve who? The tenants, residents, right?
Residents,
So
but-
you don't think that it's important for us to know or to have any input from those who are going to be subjected?
I think it's
This
more
new
important
program?
to take, let's see, there are 153,000 units online for NYCHA right now out of 190,000, and trying to figure out how to put the remaining 37 or 40,000 units back online to serve those residents, it seems to me would be the higher priority.
Well,
That's
the
what
higher,
NYCHA is trying to do.
but that has to be coupled. Those are not RAD units, sir.
No, that's not it. Public housing units, 190. They have approximately 153,000 units online, if I recall correctly. Just my recollection.
Yeah.
It's 10 years old now, but it's rough.
Have there been any studies conducted to show RAD or MTW will generate the billions needed from the private sector? In New York, we have a $17 billion backlog of needed repairs and improvements. If there has been any study.
RAD was just enacted out of appropriations in late 2012. There would be no study because they're really just starting. RAD is just now going, they just increased it to 185,000 units, and some of those units make sense to refinance and convert, and others don't.
So
there would be no study.
Before we embark in that journey of expanding RAD, shouldn't we know that it will accomplish in terms of the numbers and the resources that will bring from the private sector before we expand it?
I think at the end of the day, we already know when the private sector will get into finance or not. And they'll get into finance when underwriting the deal makes sense. In the case of New York, some of those deals are not going to make sense, which is why New York's going through the exercise that it's going through. But in other parts of the country, it's indispensable to go through RAD because they can't otherwise keep the units.
I am not saying not to expand it or not going into it. What I want to make sure is that it's not, the public assets are not privatized, because once they are privatized, we're going to lose them. Mr. Briggs, the Housing Trust Fund, which should see its first funding award next year, is the only federal program focused on creating affordable housing for extremely low-income households. Why is this an important piece of federal housing policy today?
Extremely important, ma'am, for two reasons. One, the source of revenue, namely Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. In other words, it looks beyond the appropriations envelope, which has been insufficient for years and years now to meet these needs. And number two, because of the targeting you mentioned, without federal capital to help, as Mr. Cabrera said, these financings work, they do not pencil out, they will not happen.
Thank you.
Time of the
Yield back.
gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Nagelbauer, chairman of our Financial Institutions Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to Mr. Cabrera just a minute and be talking about these data and the metrics. And, you know, we've been talking about moving to work, and there's not data in one place, and Ms. Glover makes a great point there. But if you're an agency and you're going to do pilot programs, does it make sense for you to measure the success of those programs?
As a pilot program for services, absolutely, yes.
Does anybody disagree that if you're an agency or a company or anybody that's doing a pilot program, that you should measure the success of that program so that you can determine whether, because with the word pilot to me comes, that means let's try this on a limited basis and see if it works on a larger basis. Mr. Briggs, would you agree or disagree with that?
I'd strongly agree with that, sir. However, as a longtime evaluator and a funder of evaluation.
I don't have time for a lot of elaboration, but I think.
No, sir, but I wanted to explain myself
everybody
if you give
to
me
be
a...
on the record here is that we need, if we're going to have HUD expand its mission, I'm a little perplexed by some of my colleagues that don't want to do these programs because of the limited resources. Well, the whole purpose of doing these programs, RAD, whether it's moving to work, I think Mr. Husock mentioned, looking at ground leases and thinking outside the box, is that we are trying to expand the resources coming into housing for American families, but you can't do that if you don't, think outside the box. But if you're going to think outside the box, it does make sense to me, and maybe it's just the old accountant in me, that if we're going to try these things, we need to be able to measure their success or not. Ms. Glover, one of the things that I think you said in page 10 of your written testimony, that after a period of transition of larger agencies to moving to work and the deregulations of smaller agencies is accomplished, the public housing side of HUD should reposition itself to become an asset manager and work with its various customers to agree on a set desired outcome based on congressional mandates. What do you mean about HUD should become an asset manager?
What I mean is looking at the impact that the investments that are being made by HUD is having on the families, the communities, and cities. And so that's the skill set, and one of the things that Mr. Cabrera talked about are the systems in order to do that. And so when you gather data, if you can imagine with over 3,000 housing authorities, there's a lot of data coming in consistently. And so taking the time to streamline the systems, agree on outcomes, I think one of the problems is that too many of the regulations are so prescriptive that you're measuring too many things. So if you can simplify it to identify the 5 or 10 things that are wanting to be achieved through a program, and then bringing that data in, then all of this discussion about impact, data, and all of that will be at the fingertips, and you can push a button and be able to roll up all of that data. So a good asset manager will be able to have that data readily available to inform the policymakers.
Go back to the moving to work. One of the things that we hear from folks is, bringing more capital to the table. Did you, in your experience with moving to work, did you experience that you were able to attract private sector capital with some aspects of that program?
Absolutely. And I want to just take 2 minutes on the RAD demonstration. The way the additional capital comes in for underwriting purposes is that you took the operating subsidy and the capital funds, which basically made an underwritable rent that could then be used to go to the private market, because the private investors are going to want to know if debt is raised, that there is sufficient rent to cover not only the operating costs, but the debt costs. And by doing public-private partnerships, you're able to attract other resources, because the foundations will typically play their other resources. And so these are complicated deals, but through leverage and looking at things in creative ways, it can attract additional resources to the programs.
Thank you, ma'am.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, ranking member of the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was interested in the conversation for a lot of reasons. Once, when the question came about when the program started, I turned to Mr. Green immediately and said it was approved in 1996. I know because I was mayor and ran the housing authority. Or more accurately, I appointed the board that ran the housing authority. The program was actually implemented in 1998. The problem, and I think we're debating issues that are not the problem. From my perspective, this program is more of a deregulatory program than it is a moving to work program. And I think HUD made a mistake, frankly, in trying to bill it as something else. I mean, deregulation of requirements in the voucher program is what made, in some quarters, the moving to work program attractive. And I think the moving to work program, which started as a demonstration project, I mean, can be massaged and developed into a program that is, you know, workable. And keep in mind, I think it's important to understand this, that the moving to work dollars actually takes money out of the voucher program and sends it elsewhere. And so it creates some problems. And one of the assumptions is that private investment is just, or investors are waiting to become a part of this program. I would like for any of you to address the issue of private investment and how they are standing in line waiting to invest in the program. Mr. Cabrera.
Congressman, good to see you again as always. Moving to work does not take Section 8 dollars and move them somewhere else.
Voucher, yes, yes.
Moving to work removes the division between Section 8 of the Housing Act of 1937 and Section 9 of the Housing Act of 37 to allow fungibility. If that's what you mean by
That's
taking
exactly
money,
what I mean.
that's a very different issue. It just becomes one big pool, not two or actually three divided pools. So that's the one, it's not so much a correction, it's that it's not a pull, it's a pooling. And that pooling allows for, it's part of my answer, that pooling allows for the leveraging of capital in order to undertake many of the developments that MTW jurisdictions undertake. And a person who did that marvelously is sitting to my left. So I'm going to let her answer.
Before, I mean, I would like, you know, anybody to answer, even people sitting out there and walking the halls. What I'm interested in is somebody telling me about the private sector waiting to become involved.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood your question. So what happens is, remember that when you have land that is public housing, it is subject to a deed of trust unless it's converted out. And so therefore, the Public Housing Authority generally goes out and looks for private sector developers.
Right.
They do public-private partnerships. And yes, most MTWs, candidly, beyond MTWs these days, a lot of housing authorities, MTW and not, are becoming not just property managers, which is what they traditionally were, but developers. They go out, they partner with a developer, they develop units using typically, as we had said, the low-income housing tax credit or the private activity bond option, and they develop, but absolutely that's moving in that direction inexorably.
You do understand that the low-income tax credits are becoming increasingly difficult to obtain.
Oh, Mr. Congressman, I ran a housing finance agency. They've been difficult to obtain since 1996. They're a very competitive setting, but private activity bonds aren't. Private activity bonds generally are upon application because volume cap is basically flush everywhere.
Yeah.
So so there are options.
We're
The point
together
is
on
you've
that.
got two options.
Yeah, we're together on that. Ms. Glover.
In terms of what Mr. Cabrera was talking about, by eliminating the silos between the funding, an agency is able to devise a strategic plan and say, for example, like with the issues of homelessness or supportive housing, put the money in a pool, use that to attract a private sector development partner to go out to the market to either raise tax credits or private activity bonds so that the housing can be developed and supported. The key thing is that the amount of subsidy that's needed when added to the tenant rents has to be sufficient so that the debt service or other requirements can be serviced. And by having the flexibility of the money, that enables creativity on the ground as opposed to having to act strictly.
My time is running out. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy, chairman of our Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the panel being here. I think oftentimes when we talk about HUD and poverty, there's an urban perspective or urban prism in which we look through. I come from rural Wisconsin, and this is the third year we're hosting a summit, a homelessness and hunger summit, where we bring in all the players who help provide housing and food assistance to those who are in need to talk about the bright spots of who's using the community and programs in the best way to help the most people out. I'm honored this year that Secretary Castro is going to come. I think it's important that he sees a little different perspective on poverty, and we're honored that he's going to come and participate in our third annual event. But as I hope as we have this conversation, we make sure we look at everybody who comes across these difficult problems in their life. I'm not sure if the chairman gave this quote, but in 1964, President Johnson said, and we've heard this quite a bit, quote, "We've declared unconditional war on poverty. Our objective is total victory. I believe that 30 years from now, Americans will look back upon these 1960s as the time of the great American breakthrough toward the victory of prosperity over poverty." Does anyone on the panel believe that we've actually met that objective? We've reached that victory? Mr. Briggs and Ms. Glover, we have.
Thank you, Mr. Duffy.
Yeah.
You know, any skilled evaluator would recommend that we ask the but-for question. But for HUD, or other agencies for that matter, what would the conditions on the ground be? What would the outcomes be? And if you ask the question, would poverty be worse, and would the poverty rate be higher, but for HUD, the answer is unequivocally yes to both of those questions.
I'm going to reclaim my time because, first of all, I want to be clear. I agree with the mission. We have to help people out. And I agree with Ms. Waters. We want to, and I think the whole panel, our objective should be to put people back to work. I'm sorry, Ms. Glover, you want to go?
I was just going to add that if you put everything in perspective, not only are the HUD programs operating in the larger economy, but there are things that happen to the economy as well. And there's no question that the Great Recession was a setback for many people. There are many more people living in poverty today than they were before. And so I think that if you try to keep everything static, it's not realistic that the larger impact of the economy is not going to pull some people down. I think the question is, it is a but-for, and people have risen and they're coming, but we have new people coming into the economy. So the question is, can we adopt policies that are flexible enough that we can react and respond to the needs? And it's important that people are rising up. Now, the income gap is a huge challenge, and we have to stay focused on building the middle class. That's absolutely the right focus, but HUD's programs have indeed helped, and I think the innovations of the last 50 years have been very impactful, and we need to do more of those.
And I'm going to give you some more time in 1 second, Ms. Glover, but I also, first of all, I don't think the mission of defeating poverty has been met. It still exists in our communities, and I think that was the mission of President Johnson. I get concerned because in our communities, I hear there's a lot of people who have disabilities, but there's disabilities that they can actually overcome if they get some assistance and some help. So they're not long-term disabled, but with some help, especially for mental illness, they can get out of the assistance of government and back into self-sustainability. And I think it's important that we make sure that we provide that assistance and help to them. Before I'm not going to ask another question, except to Ms. Glover. I got to tell you, your biography and all the great work that you've done in the Atlanta Housing Authority is absolutely amazing. I got about a minute left. Would you just kind of recap your story and the successes that you had in Atlanta?
Well, in very short term, in the time I have, we were fortunate to be able to have great public-private partnerships in solving very deep issues. And we worked not only with private sector players, but with the residents, the larger community. And it was really about a community coming together to solve problems where people were living in absolutely deplorable conditions. And so we've been able to help families move responsibly from those terrible places and actually redevelop mixed income, mixed use communities, supportive housing. We've had families invested in terms of changing mindsets, rebuilding lives, building family resiliency. And so we're going to do more of that, and that's continuing. And we've leveraged, we took 300 million and leveraged over $3 billion of economic impact and investment.
Not many people have the opportunity to take dysfunctional organizations and turn them into well-functioning organizations that actually help so many people. You are one of the bright spots, so thank you. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Husock.
Thank you, Chairman Henserling and Ranking Member Waters, for holding this important hearing on HUD and its impact on federal housing policy. I'd also like to thank our panelists for testifying today. Housing programs under HUD are a lifeline for many of our children in low-income families, yet we have long waiting lists for HUD programs. As we celebrate HUD's 50th anniversary, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to work together to increase federal investments in innovative programs that address housing and at the same time take a holistic approach at helping our disadvantaged citizens move up the economic ladder. My first question is for Ms. Renee Glover. As you know, there has been much talk about consolidating many of the rural housing programs currently under the United States Department of Agriculture into the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Given the difference in the populations and the geographic areas served by rural housing programs as compared to HUD programs, as well as the manner in which HUD and the USDA service their respective housing programs, do you think consolidation is a good idea?
Well, let me say this. I'm not familiar with the proposal, but the concern would be that resources are not lost if there is a consolidation. And I think what happens too often is that the consolidation occurs, but the resources that were being dedicated to that population aren't following the clients and customers who are being served. I think one of the big issues in terms of supporting families with mental disabilities is that as the state mental institutions were closed, the thesis was that the resources that were being dedicated there would follow the families, and then there would be supportive housing developed in local communities to support those families to be successful. But what happened is that as those institutions were closed, the resources didn't follow. They were redirected to other resources and challenges. So I think the devil is always in the detail. So I think that a thoughtful approach should be looked at, but also with the strong recommendation that the resources that are there not get lost in the consolidation.
Thank you. The next question is for Dr. Xavier Briggs. In 1970, we had 300,000 surplus of low-cost rental units relative to the low-income rental households. According to the National Low-Income Housing today, there is a shortage of 7 million affordable rental units. What are the factors driving the shortages in affordable housing, and what should the federal government be doing differently? And are market-based approaches working?
Thank you, Mr. Hinojosa. You have two main drivers, sir. You've got the drivers holding down incomes, and then you've got the drivers driving up costs. In other words, this is a structural gap. It was decades in the making. It didn't happen overnight.
That's right.
And there are significant forces operating on both the cost side of the equation and the income side of the equation. In brief, on the cost side of the problem or the gap, you have largely local land use decisions and other factors making it expensive, in some jurisdictions impossible, to develop affordable housing or to preserve what we have. And we've seen a tremendous erosion, and that contributes to the numbers that you cited. That's on the cost side of the equation. The income side of the equation, as the members know quite well, this has been widely documented in the media, we've seen a lot of wage stagnation in this country. The minimum wage is stuck at a quite low level in inflation-adjusted terms. So we've had stagnant incomes, limited incomes, rising housing costs. That produces the kind of shortfall that you called off. One clear implication of that applies to Congress as a whole, and not only this committee, with due respect. You don't want to fight a challenge like that or address a gap like that with one hand tied behind your back. You need to address both the income and the cost side of the equation, or we won't be successful. We won't act in a way that's commensurate with the scale of the problem, which we are paying for in so many systems, health, education, and beyond. So the tax code is implicated here. The minimum wage is implicated here. And yes, local regulations also are implicated in this gap between income, especially from wages, and housing costs on the bottom.
You've made some very good points, and I wish we had more time to let me ask 2 more questions, but my time has expired.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank the chairman for calling the hearing and the witnesses for their testimony here today. I think it's important that after 50 years declaring the war on poverty and against homelessness and close to $2 trillion spent, and appropriate that we look back and say how were those dollars allocated and how were they spent. My first question is for Dr. Briggs. On page 7 of your testimony, by the way, I come from, your background is in urban planning. I come from Bucks County, Pennsylvania. I lived my entire life in Levittown, which is a community that was hyper-planned, some say. A lot of returning World War II and Korea veterans who were able to obtain a house in that community based on the VA mortgage. But what I noticed growing up in that community was that in Levittown, there seemed to be in the 70s and 80s more jobs than houses. And so the community was doing well. And in my experience and looking back, communities that have more houses than jobs are those that are in trouble. You say on page 7 of your testimony, as part of your solution to making housing assistance a contributor to self-reliance and economic self-sufficiency, there's a quote from your testimony, it's crucial that we support effective pro-work housing policy for households that are not elderly or disabled. And you go on to mention that work has long been a prized and deeply felt goal. And, quote, work provides income and dignity. And I agree with all that. So my question to you, Dr. Briggs, is would you support work requirements for non-elderly and non-disabled, able-bodied working individuals, perhaps as a condition of a Section 8 housing voucher?
Thank you. It really depends on how they're constructed. I'm sorry to offer what might be a complex answer, and we want these things to be simple, but they're not. I don't think that an across-the-board work requirement would produce the effect that we want to see. There's a tremendous motivation to work amongst the great majority of housing-assisted households. The question is, what jobs are available? Are we investing in skills? Are we investing in work supports like childcare? And are there good, affordable housing alternatives available for households that obtain work and wish to move out? If you look at the #1 reason people leave housing assistance, it's because they get work. So the motivation is clearly there, and we need to be extremely careful about across-the-board requirements.
So do you support a requirement for work for able-bodied individuals?
The one answer I can give you is that it very much depends on how that's constructed. It depends on whether it comes with supports for childcare, intensive skill investments, the kinds that we see in Jobs Plus. I also would agree with Mr. Husock that there are disincentives in rent policy now. And if we change those, as Jobs Plus did, and it was very rigorously evaluated and produced, as you probably know, very significant effects, that would be a very, very smart way to go and to support work by very poor households.
Mr. Cabrera, do you support work requirements?
I'm very much in the same place as Javier. The reason is because here's what happens. If you wind up with work requirements and you have someone, and I'll just come up with a common example, a single mother with more than one child, you've just essentially kept them from housing, and they'll wind up homeless. So you're going to be dealing with it as a federal subsidy on the homeless side. It's not, I'm not in favor of compelling that kind of activity generally. It's just, it's something I have to work through, but it's very difficult.
How about local flexibility, providing flexibility to state, county housing authorities, public housing agencies to, and Ms. Glover was responding to a question from the ranking member earlier on that question of local flexibility, where, if you can tailor programs, federally funded programs, to what's happening in a local community, should a local community be permitted to have some sort of work requirement as a condition proceeding to getting a Section 8 certificate, especially for those communities where you have generational poverty and one generation after the other living in the same community on the same Section 8 housing certificate.
That's extraordinarily rare, just so I say it. The concern I have is that compelling thing. We as a government compelling people to do things in that way is something I think I'm just anathema to. So it's going to be really hard for me to say yes to that.
Ms. Glover, you were cut off earlier when you were responding to the ranking member's question. It had to do with providing local flexibility to housing authorities. You have some experience in Atlanta about that. Can you expand on that briefly?
Yes, I think it's very important that the people on the ground and in the locality have the flexibility to do the problem solving, because first they understand the conditions, they're able to reach out to the other players, and on the work requirement, what we did with disabled and elderly persons, they were exempted from the requirement. But those families who were able-bodied, we worked with the various civil society groups to do job training, counseling, child care. We had a whole network of some 60 organizations to support success. And I think if you provide those types of resources, and the program is both job and/or education, you're building resiliency and the ability to be successful in the workforce.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding these hearings today. We had interesting subcommittee hearing yesterday on much the same subject. At that and I commend, for those of you looking for more material to read, to look at the transcript of that hearing. We dealt with flood insurance, which is important to me, even though I represent a city built in the desert in the midst of a drought. And H.R. 3700, which I think has come up in this hearing, has some excellent provisions to encourage condominiums. I own 2 suburban homes, so I'm a really bad advocate for it, but I'm an advocate for multifamily housing. It's affordable, and our homeless problem can also be viewed as just a housing affordability problem. And it is, we've got to help our struggling families. It's more energy efficient, and even more energy efficient than the housing itself is that multifamily housing is the first step toward a viable mass transit system, and it offers flexibility. I'm told by many that if you buy a place, you really shouldn't buy a place if you're not pretty certain you're going to be there for 4 or 5 years. A lot of people can't know where they're going to live 4 or 5 years from now. Every 2 years, people suggest that I stop living where I'm living and find another line of work. With this in mind, Mr. Cabrera, what can HUD do to encourage the private sector to expand its role in providing affordable housing? I refer to property owners, managers, developers. And are there regulations in place at HUD that discourage private participation in affordable housing?
Sorry. I think that the best step forward in terms of what HUD can do is to provide the market with as much certainty as it can have, and to have reasonable standards that can be met. One example is actually cited in my written testimony, and it's in the case of FHA. There is a program, an FHA program, very useful program, the 223F program. It is a refinancing program. It helps reposition affordable housing deals that are already going to be impacting the federal budget if they go sideways, and helps them become healthier. And a couple of years ago, HUD revisited its underwriting guidelines. It increased the reserve requirements in the FHA program, the 223F program, by a multiple. I mean, several multiples. It was huge. And what it did was it killed deals. So today you have 50% fewer units being financed through the 223F program as there were just 24 months ago. And similarly, there are other places where that conversation pops up. It popped up in RAD. So they'll make a rule. The rule negatively impacts the utilization of RAD. The rule, in that case, again, had to do with operating reserves because what they make is a bureaucratic decision that isn't aligned with the marketplace.
I'm going to try to sneak in
and it gets messy.
one more question. We need 300,000 or 400,000 new constructed apartments every year. Last year, we just got 255,000. That's up 37% from the year before, but it's still inadequate. In addition, we're losing 100,000 to 150,000 units to obsolescence, and those are the units that are affordable. Are there any government programs that we can tweak here that would be helpful in getting some of these 100 to 150,000 units rehabilitated rather than withdrawn from service? And what else can we do to solve the supply crisis?
The supply crisis, from a HUD perspective, can be helped simply by revisiting how it is HUD approaches all underwriting and facilitating responsible underwriting wherever it can, without adding things that don't make sense in the marketplace. Now, I have to laud the prior administration and the current administration. Secretary Donovan did a terrific job of having that revisited, and it improved. That isn't to say that it improved perfectly. It did not. And I think what happens is that, just knowing HUD as I do, what you see is retrenchment. And that retrenchment causes static in the marketplace, and it keeps good deals from happening. One of the things HUD can do is just learn how to get out of the way. You don't always need to be in the way. You need to be in a way when the taxpayer is at risk in an unreasonable way. But there's always going to be risk. If there isn't risk, there's a problem. Forgive me, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for your testimony. And I represent a congressional district in central Kentucky where the Lexington Housing Authority is one of those moving to work programs. It's been a great success. Austin Sims, who runs that housing authority, does a great job, and I think is a model for how the moving to work program offers that flexibility and fungibility of dollars, and they've made it work very, very well. I do want to revisit this issue of work requirements that my colleague, Mr. Fitzpatrick, was talking about, because I think that we need to look at work not as a punishment, but as a blessing that we want to celebrate, a road to self-sufficiency. And I noted, Mr. Cabrera and Mr. Briggs, your reticence to fully embrace universal work requirements as a condition of Section 8 or other public housing assistance. But I want to challenge you a little bit on that, because it seems to me that if the concern is child care, or if the concern is job training as a necessary part of that, that we could certainly offer that as part of modernization of a universal work requirement. So what is it that is holding you back from fully embracing a work requirement, not as a means of punishing beneficiaries, but as a means of recognizing that poor people in need of housing are not liabilities to be managed, but they're assets, and they have tremendous potential if we offer them the blessing of work?
Then I think I would answer in the following way. It shouldn't be a precondition of someone being housed. It should be structured in a different way, such that it's not compelling someone to work, it's compelling someone to get in a position to find better work. That's a very different proposition. And if the issue becomes, look, if you live here, you need to improve the circumstances in which you're in order to improve your economic circumstance for your family and for yourself. I think I can't speak for my colleagues, but I'm willing to bet my bottom dollar that they would all agree that that would be the right way to go. What I'm concerned about is having, as a precondition, you cannot live here unless you have a job. That, I think, is counterproductive.
If I could just jump in there, what if it's not that, but and by the way, the Congressional Research Service is telling us here that non-elderly, non-disabled households account for a full 45%. So it's just not true, at least according to the Congressional Research Service, that all of the Section 8 beneficiaries out there or assisted housing individuals are elderly or disabled. There's plenty of non-elderly, non-disabled people out there who don't have wage income but yet are receiving taxpayer assistance for housing. Any thoughts?
Well, the vast majority of the people who are receiving wage income and who are receiving, let's go by each pot, Section 8, work for a living. Those people actually, that's not the issue. I think if I'm hearing this correctly, and I'm asking to be corrected if I'm not, you're concerned about those who aren't, that can work but don't. And if that's the case, usually it has to do with whether it is we're willing to, as a federal entity, help them put themselves in the best position and condition housing upon that.
And maybe
in
if
that case, sure.
And maybe if they're underemployed or need skills, maybe it shouldn't just be a work requirement, but a requirement that you're either working or that you're pursuing some kind of job training. And that as a part of that assistance, there's some child care if that's needed.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the biggest piece that in my experience, and again, I'm gonna defer to Renee, but in my experience, the biggest impediment and the person I have in mind is a single mother with children, is their children. The reason they have such a tough time going out there is because someone has to deal with their children.
Absolutely.
That's why I'm saying the training and the child care is indispensable.
And that's perfectly reasonable. That makes sense. And Ms. Glover, I think to your testimony earlier, that's how you all did it successfully in Atlanta.
That is correct.
That's great. Mr. Briggs, did you have a...
Thank you, sir. Just briefly, so the effects of any such requirement would depend on a few things, actually quite straightforward to think about. Conditions in the labor market, provision of work supports, and those other factors that directly affect families or an adult's ability to get and to keep work, let alone to get ahead. There is a great deal that is appealing in principle about the compact, Congressman, that you're outlining. Sadly, I have to note, we have a history as a country of reneging on some part or another of that deal, either not funding the child care, not directing TANF funds, state TANF funds, properly to job creation in order to improve labor market conditions. There is, I think you're right, sir, great bipartisan agreement that we should move in this direction. The question is how, and the different pieces of that compact do need to be in place.
Thank you. My time has expired, but I'd love to work with all of you on crafting that. Thank you very much.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, ranking member of our Financial Institutions Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Waters for conducting this hearing on the future of housing in America. Let me start with Mr. Briggs, and I'd like to ask about the effectiveness and cost trends in the housing voucher program. President George W. Bush's FY08 budget request said the Section 8 tenant-based rental assistance program is the federal government's foremost program for assisting low-income families to rent decent, safe, and sanitary housing in the private market. Based on an assessment of the program, this is one of the departments in the federal government's most effective programs. This program has been recognized as a cost-effective means for delivering safe, decent, and sanitary housing to low-income families. And in fact, in nominal terms, the average housing assistance payment per voucher rose from $75.53 in 2010 to just $76.73 in 2014, an increase of only 1.6%. During the same period, rent and utility costs in the private market rose by 10.6%. If the purpose of today's hearing is to discuss the impact HUD has had on housing policy and reducing poverty over the past 50 years, it seems that the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program is something we should hold up and celebrate. And Mr. Briggs, what recommendations do you have for how we might build on the success of this program?
Thank you, Mr. Clay. I have several recommendations for this committee. The first is to ensure that funding for the program is sustained as a floor. Congress, this is both sides of the aisle, have acted, as you are well aware, to cut veterans' homelessness. That was a direct result of adding incremental vouchers in the form of VASH, as they're known. That is a direct indicator that this program is this country's #1 tool for preventing or ending homelessness on a very large scale. And as you've heard Orlando and other panelists underscore, we will pay the costs somewhere. We'll pay them in health, we'll pay them in jails, we'll pay them in education systems, in some system if we don't address these needs. It's tremendously important to fully fund the program. There are flexibilities, there are connections between the vouchers and capital subsidies, so that vouchers can help to ensure that the very lowest income households can lease up in mixed income dwellings. Those kinds of things should be encouraged, in my judgment, by Congress. HUD is on that road already. It needs the encouragement, and streamlining can be a part of that.
And so this program is one of the government's most cost-effective programs, and your recommendation is that we continue to support it and fund it properly.
That's absolutely right, sir. And from the standpoint of national policy goals, expanding it would be the right thing to do. I would add, however, that the big costs in the program are not driven by HUD practices, but by local housing costs that HUD doesn't control directly, and by tenant incomes, which are a story about what's going on in the wider economy. So again, if we want to address this, we need HUD to be at its best, but we also need more than HUD. This program is extremely important and effective.
Thank you for your response. And Mr. Cabrera, you mentioned the 223F program, and a few years ago you said HUD increased reserve requirements and it killed deals. What do you think? What do you, in the best of all worlds, what should HUD do now to revise this program?
The 223F programs, like all FHA programs, is an insurance program. There is a private lender that's lending the money that's being insured. They're the at-risk party, the initial at-risk party. And the federal government's responsibility is when the deal goes sideways. Have faith in the private market. The private market knows that deal as well as anybody. The person looking for the deal knows it. The idea that the private market would request or want, or require rather, one set of reserves, and that HUD would, in order to get the insurance, which would facilitate the deal, multiply that by 3, 4, 5 times is a little bit out of kilter.
Thank you for that. I think HUD needs to reevaluate what they've done.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here with us today. I am reading from the Inspector General's report of HUD that was a report from the period of through 2014 up through this month of 2015. And in the report, they identify, I'll just read to you, public housing authorities provide public housing assistance to as many as 25,226 families whose income exceeded HUD's 214 eligibility income limits. Going on, they say, as a result, HUD did not assist as many low-income families in need of housing as it could have. We estimate that HUD will pay as much as $104 million over the next year for public housing units occupied by over-income families that otherwise could have been used to house eligible low-income families in need of housing assistance. How do you respond to that, Mr. Cabrera?
I struggle with that report. There are considerable inaccuracies in the report that I would love to have responded to. But the first one is it's 25,000 residents out of a pool of roughly 990,000. There are always going to be mistakes. Should we fix those mistakes? Absolutely. I'm all for it. I think that addressing the issue is pertinent.
Is that kind
I think
of
it's important.
I mean, if we can fix
No,
mistakes,
I don't think it's being glossed over. I think what has to happen is we have a system that encourages how we count income for public housing in very strange ways. And I don't question that there are people who are wrongly over income in public housing.
Let me give you some income amounts. Los Angeles, the member with the highest income earned $132,224. New Bedford housing, the member with the highest income earned $129,789.
Right, but Congressman, under the Brooke Amendment, 40% of public housing units have to be leased to people at 30% of AMI and below, area median income and below. Everything else is really up to the housing authority, and to some degree, some of those folks are going to be outside of the bandwidth anyway. I'm not encouraging this. I'm not saying the result's good. I'm saying it's
doing a good job.
It's not throwing baby out with bathwater. It's let's think about it as opposed to let's think about how to solve it as opposed to anything else. Because
no, I think that's what we're about here today, is reforming and not glossing over things.
Right.
The American
I would never gloss
taxpayer
over.
really deserves accountability on these dollars.
Yes.
And by just assuming, well, these things are going to happen and it's part of the process, I think the American people are tired of that. I think they want real accountability inside of our government, and we're not seeing that. When we're showing right now that in New York alone, there's 10,250 people who have over-income housing. Why is there an accountability?
I would
Why do you
rather
have people living in housing that make $129,000.
I would far rather that resource go to people who need it than people who don't.
I think that's what
agree
we're
with
about
you.
today. And it's not the status quo that should be acceptable. I think what we're about is bringing reforms in here that make it so we're really helping the people who need the help. Nobody's saying we're going to take an eraser and erase it all. But what we do want to bring is real fiscal accountability back to our government, and this is part of it. If people are abusing this system, and the American taxpayer is very tired of that, we need to eliminate the abuse.
We agree.
Ms. Glover, do you have any comments?
No, my only observation is that we fix the problem and not just throw the baby out with the bathwater. And too often, problems are fixed where there aren't any, so target the correction to the offender and the problem as opposed to recasting the entire program.
I think you sense from us our interest and our commitment to help those who really need the safety net. We've always been about that, but I think what we are as much about is making sure that the American taxpayer is protected and that we are not just have a slush fund where there's $100+ million that could be given to people who actually have a need.
I couldn't
Mr.
agree with you
Husock,
more.
do you have a
Thank you.
comment?
Yes, the over-income is certainly a problem, and MTW, Moving to Work, gives local authorities the chance to suggest a time limit, and that would have addressed that situation quite possibly. I think it's just as much of a problem that we have such long-term tenancies.
Absolutely.
And that I would address the committee's concern to that as well.
I certainly agree. Thank you very much. My time has expired.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The first thing I want to do is say hello to my good friend, Ms. Renee Glover. Your work in housing and your contributions to this nation are just extraordinary, and they are of a soaring magnitude. And we are very grateful for your work and your service. And I personally have enjoyed working with you, not only in my tour as congressman, but as you know, I served in the state Senate. And I want you to, but you know, before I get to this, I must respond a bit to what my ranking leader, Ms. Waters, said. There is this myth that we need to put to bed about people not wanting to work, and especially people that want to work so bad. You know, I represent a district, as you know, Ms. Glover, in the Senate before I got here for 20 years, that had most of the housing projects in the city of Atlanta. And I knew then what the issue was, and that was helping people to get the jobs. Started that jobs fair there, and it all blossomed up every year, as you recall. We worked with that. We work with your formula of using your innovation in housing to leverage, for you knew that at the core of this is an economic issue. And each year we would do the jobs fair. And let me just tell you something, committee members. Last year, our jobs fair attracted 20,000 people. We were able to get 5,522 jobs, and 98% of them were African American, and most of whom were men, but two categories, African Americans and veterans. Now, the reason I mention that is these are the two most basic groups that are crying out to get help with jobs, to help stay in their homes. And so there must be a structure, an infrastructure that is built, not only just to moan about this moving back to work program, but we have to have something in there that provides the work. Job fairs, other kinds of structures, to be able to make sure, because people want to work. They're not out there not wanting to work. We've got to research and get into these communities and build that structure in there to get the job opportunities to them. Now, Ms. Glover, Carver Homes and Techwood Homes. It's very important that I kind of set the stage for this, because Carver Homes is located, because many people have been to Atlanta, but in order to show what you did, Carver Homes is right there at where the Atlanta Stadium, where the home of the Braves are. Techwood is up where Georgia Tech is. So if you've been to Atlanta, you know where that is. Can you share for us a bit, Ms. Glover, how you've used this economic leverage and your input in getting jobs for people in the community, and how that worked in that mixed use projects that you did in Carver Homes and Techwood Homes?
Well, thank you, sir. And let me return the compliment to you. You have been a magnificent public servant and an outstanding congressman and senator at the state level. And I, too, have enjoyed working with you and think the world of you. So thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.
In terms of our revitalization of those communities, we worked with the private sector, the foundation sector, the supportive services sector, so that we could create communities of opportunity. And those communities were in terrible condition when we started in the 90s. The workforce participation was at about 13%, and people were desperately poor, and rather than the families being able to rebuild their lives, they were trapped structurally out of the mainstream. So in working with the families and working with the private sector, we were able to create a master plan that leveraged the human potential as well as the real estate potential. And we always say that all people are children of God with unlimited human potential, and so the work was directed to tap into that human potential. So it's a both and. So it's working with the real estate, and that leveraged typically 10-to-1 of the public dollars that were in, either through the tax credit program, private activity bonds and tax credits, other affordable housing programs, to close the gap on the development. And it's a true economically integrated community that had market rate families, families who needed assistance, typically 40%. And these are long-term affordable units and will always be, as long as the ground lease is in effect, at least 60 years. And then tax credit affordable units. And that was developed, and it's been magnificent. We've also developed single-family homes. Yes. But we also work with the neighborhood schools, and so housing policy and education policy, too, are important, because we wanted to have great neighborhood schools, because that attracts families to the neighborhood. And so it's been a very, very impactful and tremendous program.
Thank you, Ms. Glover, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving that extra minute.
Time of the gentleman has definitely expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Holtgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here to discuss a very important topic. something that absolutely impacts all of our constituents. And it's so clear to me that home ownership advances the American dream, encourages a responsible citizen, and promotes lasting community involvement, which is something we all want. I believe that the people in my district should have access to the financial tools they need to be able to invest in this worthwhile goal, to provide a lasting home for their families, and also to build their net worth. Federal housing policy should reflect our commitment to those Americans who include homeownership on their list of life and financial objectives. We should also hold agencies like the Department of Housing and Urban Development accountable to ensure that federal housing programs are exceptional stewards of taxpayer dollars and meaningful mechanisms through which we can help people out of poverty. I'm interested in exploring ways that we can more effectively serve seniors and low-income families in our communities, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to be able to learn more from you all and the work that you've done. I want to address my first couple of questions to Mr. Husock, if that's okay. America is facing significant challenges when it comes to providing our citizens with affordable housing. In the 5 years ending in 2014, the number of renter households was up by 4.7 million, while the number of homeowner households was down by almost 600,000. The U.S. is on the cusp of fundamental change in our housing dynamics as changing demographics and housing preferences drive more people away from the typical suburban house. I wonder if you could offer insight as to what can be done to prepare our nation for a more balanced housing policy, one that recognizes the realities of the changing housing market that we're facing.
Thank you so much. Of course, a lot of what is a local decision is beyond the reach of HUD. However, I know that under Secretary Kemp's leadership, there was a good deal of emphasis that has fallen by the wayside somewhat to call attention to local communities as to how they may adjust their zoning codes in a way to encourage balanced construction of different housing types so as to accommodate the range of needs that may go beyond, and do go beyond, as you point out, a desire simply for single-family home ownership. So a lot of these decisions, most of these decisions, are driven by local zoning and land use decisions. However, HUD can use its good offices to set an example, suggest model zoning codes, and to call attention to those efforts at the local level that have been effective.
Let me ask you specifically, since 1986, the low-income housing tax credit program, I know, has leveraged federal dollars with private investment to produce nearly 2.8 million affordable units. If we still need more affordable housing, how can LIHTC dollars be further leveraged to provide more affordable housing?
I think as with public housing and housing choice voucher units, we should consider making those units that are affordable under the LIHTC short-term in the nature of their assistance, because we have long waiting lists and we have a limited supply, and so aligning our housing policy with our overall social policy, we spend as much, if not more, on housing choice voucher as we do on TANF today. And yet the regulations regarding TANF dollars and housing choice voucher dollars are very different. So to make assistance short-term and targeted is maybe the most practical way that we can accommodate more households.
I've got one last thing I want to address real quickly with Mr. Cabrera. How have Section 202 capital advances affected the market for affordable, supportive housing for low-income seniors? Has the cessation of funding for these advances discouraged investors from building affordable senior developments to add new units?
The short answer to that is yes, it has discouraged the production of 202 units. 202 has traditionally been the engine that drives elderly housing. There is a bit of a struggle within the portfolio itself, as FHA would tell you, because it's very difficult. In some rural areas where you have 202s, you have performance issues. It's simply, you don't have enough people living there to support the debt service so that it keeps going if it's a loan as opposed to a grant. But 202, I think 202 is going to be, or a vehicle like 202, is going to be an important conversation to have, given that no one here is getting younger. So,
I feel it. My time is almost done. I will yield back my last 10 seconds.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, ranking member of our Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for appearing as well, and I thank the ranking member for her support of HUD. Mr. Chairman, I will style this brief statement why I oppose cutting funds to HUD. I oppose cutting funds to HUD because I have before me an article from the Huffington Post, July 11, 2014. It reads, "The $400 billion program to create a fleet of F-35 Joint Strike Fighter jets, which, as The Hill points out, is 7 years behind schedule and chronically plagued with misfortunes and incompetencies, could have housed every homeless person in the U.S. with a $600,000 home." I oppose cutting funds to HUD because we currently have a $38 billion gimmick to fund the military with a separate war account that has no cap on it. Spend as much as we like on war, but cap what we spend on peace in terms of homelessness. And why do I say peace? Because I know how we acquired HUD. HUD was not acquired easily. Unfortunately, and I don't condone what happened, but I can tell you the truth, the Watts riots influenced the creation of HUD. 6 days, 34 deaths, 1,032 injured, 4,000 people arrested, $40 million in property damage. HUD was not easily acquired. There had been an effort to do this for years in this country, and unfortunately, history records that the Watts riots influenced the creation of HUD. I know how we acquired the Fair Housing Act. It was after the demise of Dr. Martin Luther King that we were able to get the Fair Housing Act through Congress. So I'm here to protect HUD. I'm here to protect it because I know about the good that it's done. Notwithstanding all of the cuts through the years, the intelligence indicates that in the last 20 years, HUD has provided housing assistance to more than 35 million individuals. The HUD Home Program has produced nearly 1.2 million affordable housing units, almost 500,000 units for first-time home buyers. The Home Program has assisted nearly 300,000 tenants in obtaining direct rental assistance. CDBG has helped over 1.2 million low and moderate income persons. And I tell you, Mr. Chairman, that I oppose cutting HUD. I am here to hold back the rollback. And that's what I see happening. There are people of goodwill, by the way, with the best of intentions, who would roll back to a time when people were unable to get assistance with rent, unable to acquire the holistic approach that we just witnessed this morning. I was with the Honorable Maxine Waters when we were over at this location right here in this city that takes a holistic approach to dealing with housing issues, gets 25% of its funding from the federal government, has a $5 million a year budget. I want to protect that. I want to expand that. I'd like to see that become pervasive. I'd like to see it in my city. We cannot allow a program that has benefited Americans in times of need after a crisis such as what happened in 2008 to be cut to the bone to the extent that it becomes ineffective. and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And obviously, once again, our, I believe, collectively ultimate focus is actually not the agency, it's the people that need the services. And are we doing it the best way to touch the most lives for the maximum benefit? Mr. Briggs, you've actually a couple times touched on what many of us have been fixated, and that's particularly in our higher density areas within the country. You know, we have sort of a two-pronged problem, both income, ability to earn a living, but then the cost of housing. In land use policy, whether some people like to refer to as a model zoning code, a lot of our urban areas really do lack creativity and variability in both the way they regulate, but also the land use. What can we do as federal policymakers to turn to those urban centers and say, you're boxing out the next opportunity for affordable housing, not because of money coming from us, but because of both the regulatory costs, the zoning costs, land use, and actually your NIMBY problem. What can we do policy-wise?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm so glad you asked this question and asked it the way you did. In many senses, many communities around the country are federalizing their costs. And we are not going to make the progress we need to as a nation if we don't come at this in somewhat more creative ways. In my judgment, one of the best studies ever done of this was by the late housing economist John Quigley. He looked over a 40-year period and showed very rigorously that we have seen the problem you underline, this structural gap I talked about earlier. And a principal driver of it is what economists call supply constraints, and local land use regulation is among the most important. I would suggest approaching this as a question of both rules and incentives, because both have mattered historically. That's what the record shows. And encouraging through contingent funding, for example, contingent investments, both streamlining and more inclusionary approaches are going to be crucial in my judgment to encouraging density and a greater flexibility of housing types, as Mr. Husock.
And if you ever see a good article on it, will you send it our direction? Somewhere in my binder, I have one talking about that a housing unit built today, about 40% of it ultimately is some form of regulation. Now, we like certain regulations, but I live in the desert, and yet some of the regulations require certain types of construction materials that are absolutely inappropriate for my part of the country, but they're within the rule set. So somehow we're going to have to holistically break this down.
10-second response, if you'll allow me. I think we'd all agree that regulations exist for a variety of reasons: protect health and safety, promote environmental sustainability, including...
But it also creates barriers.
Absolutely. It's a mix.
Okay. Mr. Husock. And I prefer the word on-ramp instead of off-ramp. If right now you were designing income, job incentives, those things. So let's just use this because it's something I'm familiar with. I'm in a Section 8 housing. I'm able to get that promotion in the job because I've been a consistent worker. We know there's a math problem. There's a disincentive problem where you make a certain income leap, all of a sudden much of that is lost over here in the change of your housing costs. How would you, within seconds, can you share with me a conceptual approach of what you would do to incentivize accepting that extra work responsibilities, the extra incomes, without being punished on the other side, so it's a reasonable on-ramp?
Fix the tenant share at the outset of the lease and keep that for a fixed period of time, just the way typical renters in the private sector have a fixed cost lease.
Okay, is it Glover? Everyone seems to love you. You have an amazing story here. One of the curiosities I have is knowing some of my housing projects in the Phoenix area are, credit, rent credit, is also the discussion of incentivizing work, but the ability to manage that. And are you seeing discussions of reaching in and doing things more creatively? Babysitting co-ops, a ride-sharing vehicle that's actually at the property, things that actually make the ability to go and work that job using sort of the modern sharing economy. Are you seeing that adoption anywhere?
Well, I think that's the power of local devolution. that you can actually incent those types of things. I mean, the great news is that if you're not constrained in terms of what can be experimented with and investigated, I think there's a lot of opportunity.
So that decentralization and rule changes from my housing density or housing rules to your creativity to incentivize folks to have a future.
Absolutely. And one other quick observation on some of the local changes, very quickly, is that many localities are trying to subsidize their own budgets. So with the cuts of CDBG and home, what you're seeing are impact fees and raising,
and
higher
that's the
fees.
other side,
Because
side
at the
of
end
the
of
cost
the day,
equation.
we have to connect the dots because all of these things come together and have an impact.
Time of the
you, Mr.
gentleman
Chairman.
has
Yield back.
expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison.
Let me thank the chair, the ranking member. Appreciate having this hearing. My first question, this very quick question, is, are the poor lazy? That's my question. I had some of my colleagues make the point that we need work requirements. I got a panel up here, and I'd like to direct the panel's attention to the board. Under the voucher program, 49% of those folks are elderly or disabled. 33 of them have jobs in the voucher program, so you don't need to force them to work with a work requirement. And then you have another percentage of people who are, if you're on TANF, you're a TANF recipient, and then there's another, under the voucher, 12% that could be veterans, that could be people with a whole lot of different stories. I think the point here is that saying that you can't have housing unless you have a job, at least for the voucher program, is probably poorly thought through. Public housing, same story. People are working, and the ones who aren't working, the greater majority of them are elderly or disabled. And then project-based rental assistance, same story all over again. So, Mr. Briggs, is a work requirement smart? Is it right? Is it necessary? Does it help?
Congressman, thank you. In my judgment, it misses the point. If the idea is to make work pay and to ensure that there are work supports, given the ample evidence that there is a high level of motivation to work, as members from both sides of the aisle have said, then let's focus on those things. As your data show, many of the assisted households are either not work ready or aged out of working age, or they are in fact attached to the labor market. So to some extent, one wonders about whether we're focused on the wrong issue.
Thank you. I'll just move on from there. Can we get the next panel up, please? So here's the thing. I've asked for chart 1 to be shown on the screen. According to Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies, report 1 in 2 households spend more than 30% of their gross income on rent and utilities. 1 in 4 households pay more than 50% of their gross income for rent and utilities. We currently have more than 11 million families who pay more than half of their income for housing and utilities. And we know that 1 in 4 families is eligible for housing assistance receives it. Only 1 in 4. In my district, we have more than 10,000 low-income families on a waiting list. So I wonder, Mr. Briggs, or any of the panelists, I'd like to hear from Mr. Briggs first. When you consider the current HUD budget, what percentage of its funds go to help existing recipients of assistance? How does that percentage compare with funds available to help cost-burdened families receive vouchers or gain a slot in a subsidized home?
Well, Mr. Ellison, as the data show, we have this tremendous gap. The blue line is coming down over the last several years. That, by the way, is because of the economic recovery. The underlying data analysis show that that's about improvement in tenant incomes, which is a terrific thing and a sign of how we could create more success. But only about 1 in 4 households who are eligible for housing assistance actually get it, and that is a huge problem. And again, we are paying costs, we're just paying them in other systems.
Well, that brings me to the next slide. It's funny you should mention that. So here, this next slide I think is interesting because we spend more than $270 billion a year on housing. We spend a lot of money on housing, just not too much of it goes to poor folks. This chart shows that the bulk of the investment benefits the most financially well-off. Because of all of the tax benefits for homeownership, the mortgage interest deduction, property tax deduction, capital gains exemption. In general, upper income homeowners receive the greater benefit than do the low-income renters. And why is all this focus on like trying to shrink the small pie we already have for low-income people trying to find a leg up in this system? Can anybody talk to me about this? Ma'am?
And in one of my recommendations, I recommended that in the context of overall tax reform, that some thought be given to rebalancing home ownership and rent, but also directing the assistance to those in the greatest needs. Because
Thank you.
it's not that, and we know we're in resource constrained environments, but we need to direct it to where the greatest need is, and I think that's the rebalancing of the approach.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses here for joining us today. As Chairman Hensarling already mentioned, the Moving to Work program has largely been a success, and also an initiative that the Housing Authority of the County of San Bernardino has pioneered to the benefit of many of my constituents. And I think the extension of pre-existing MTW contracts at public housing authorities, including San Bernardino, which has a rental assistance utilization rate of higher than 90%, has been significantly delayed. It still remains undone. And Mr. Cabrera, let me ask you, what ramifications will the delay by HUD have on MTW housing authorities, and how is HUD gutting the original intent of the program as you referenced in your testimony?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that the real concern I have about HUD delaying is that eventually those contracts expire, and what you have is a housing authority going back to the usual rubric, the Housing Act of 1937, and all of the impacts. San Bernardino County is currently developing in Fontana, in Fontana, and in San Bernardino itself, excuse me, and they're redeveloping public housing, their own public housing. That's the kind of thing that'll stall that effort. And that would be the case in San Bernardino County, that would be the case for the San Diego Housing Commission, that would be the case for Santa Clara. It's important that the flexibility that has been inherent in the MPW agreements that were drafted, frankly, from 1999, because it came into being in 1998, through roughly 2008, that it stay that way. You can't take away, if you take away that flexibility, you will take away the capacity of these housing authorities to do as much as they can do with respect to their properties and their tenants.
Well, I appreciate that. Changing gears, Mr. Husock, when you think about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the central role they played in the financial crisis, do you ever ask yourself if only they'd listened? And I say that because, as you wrote in the pages of the Wall Street Journal in 2004, federally chartered but privately owned Fannie Mae, with $1 trillion in assets, is not the riskless public service entity it represents itself to be. And while you and I and the Federal Reserve Chairman Greenspan and others cried loudly at that time of systemic risk regulation, I had a bill to regulate systemic risk there, and called for higher capital, less leveraging, it was 100-to-1 leveraging, and scaled back GSEs. Sadly, those warnings fell on deaf ears here on Capitol Hill. And I don't say this to rehash history, although I think amnesia, as my colleague from New York mentioned earlier, is suffered on a bipartisan basis, but rather I hope that we might learn from the past. And specifically, I was hoping that you could comment briefly on the role the affordable housing goals had in the collapse of the GSEs and the potential impact of reopening the credit spigot with FHFA this year, calling for the Housing Trust Fund to be capitalized by Fannie and Freddie. Is there not a better way to accomplish the goals of home ownership within a market-based system than replaying this particular angle?
Thank you, Congressman Royce. I'm pleased that somebody dug out that 2004 article, and I'm flattered that you mentioned it for the record.
Oh, I've quoted you over the years on it, so thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. I worry about the affordable housing goals and worried about them at the time, not because I did not think home ownership is a valuable asset for communities. I worry that if lenders are encouraged to make loans to non-credit-worthy individuals, that their neighbors, their struggling neighbors who are making the payments on their own houses, are going to see their values collapse when foreclosure strikes in their neighborhood. And we've seen in the wake of the financial crisis that's exactly what happened, and that poor and working class neighborhoods were the most adversely affected by the affordable housing goals that have always been advanced in their name. That's my concern. And so I think we'd be remiss in continuing those affordable housing goals and in directing more funds to similar purposes.
Thank you, and again, thank these witnesses, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for this hearing.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Utah, Ms. Love.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. I'm actually encouraged by what I've been hearing from the panel, and I hope that we wouldn't take these hearings for granted, that we can come out of this hearing with some good ideas on how we're going to help our fellow Americans. First of all, what I'd like to focus on today is a bigger picture and how HUD can play a part in ending intergenerational poverty. We've seen, I've heard a lot today about how certain well-intentioned policies and programs to combat poverty, to defense of HUD has actually, there are some places where it's helped, but I also believe that it's resulted in a creation of bureaucratic, complex web of HUD programs that eventually, I think, entrench poverty and act as a barrier to upward mobility. So, just very quickly, have any of you ever been to the state of Utah? Yes? Okay, it's a great state, right? Okay. Just, my home state of Utah is actually unique in having adopted and focused specifically on intergenerational poverty. In fact, in 2012, the Utah State Legislature adopted the Intergenerational Poverty Mitigations Act. And it's to help identify the barriers that trap families in intergenerational poverty and really find solutions to help families break out of those barriers and achieve a life of dignity and self-reliance. But it's also very important to note that before that act, the act is actually dealing with a broader perspective, and housing is a portion of that. And before that, we realized that when we were working on housing stability and having people get into homes, that it was necessary and important, but it was far from enough to actually end the cycle of intergenerational poverty, which one of the concerns that we have are people coming in again, going into the same programs instead of getting people completely out of these programs. So with that being said, one of the questions I have for you, Ms. Glover, is you actually mentioned that local governments have to have the flexibility to do what they need to in terms of helping out with housing. What are your thoughts about giving local government, and what do you think we can do to give them more flexibility to deal with these problems on a local level?
Well, I think that's why there's been, and thank you very much for the question, I think that's why there's been so much discussion about moving to work. It's an unfortunate name for a program that really was about eliminating the over-regulation, if you will, of providing housing in a locality. And what it seeks to do is that it allows the local authority working with local players, local service providers, local foundations to solve the problem in that jurisdiction. Utah is very different than Georgia, California,
That's right.
and so on and so forth. And so I think in a responsible way, and if there are articulated and agreed outcomes and performance metrics, you can take the same dollars that are being allocated and put it into a pool, come up with a strategic plan, and then implement the things that are solving problems in that locality, be it homelessness, be it supportive housing needs, be it elderly housing. It also incents other players to come and participate because it also creates certainty. And I think one of the things that Mr. Cabrera talked about is investors want to know, well, what is the playing field going to be so that they aren't constantly reacting to changing rules.
Thank you. I have two more questions I have to get in seconds. The other thing I wanted to say is, do you believe that we could, HUD needs to interface with some other interventions to help break the cycle? I mean, I feel as if we're being a little too micro instead of macro, instead of looking at all the other pictures to try and see what we can do to make sure that poverty is something that we actually break intergenerational poverty. I think it can be done.
So HUD is, like many federal agencies, HUD handles data very haphazardly. And it's not because of HUD, it's because of their tools. I think given where we are, some serious thought has to be given to how you track certain outcomes that you want using that data. And I think that goes toward, for example, the Intergenerational Poverty Act.
And yes, I'd just like to mention that all of those programs are outcome-based also. And so that's why Utah's done so well. Thank you.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you and the ranking member for convening this hearing, the panel for their patience in such a long time. I want to thank Chairman Lukemeyer for being in Little Rock and visiting our public elderly facilities, as well as old and new, and new RAD projects in Little Rock. I think will be quite beneficial to the community. Also, in listening to the conversation this morning, I really do think we need to defend helping the agency, not confuse the defense of 50 years of HUD versus the programs and ideas and concepts of helping people better their lives and getting out of poverty. So I want to associate with the gentleman from Arizona's comments in that regard. And also just think to the ranking member's opening statement, I think 16% of HUD residents are over 62 was one of the things that you read. And about 46 actually think this idea of getting our communities to work well to get people in public housing off with solutions for childcare, transportation, getting to work is so very, very important, since 46% of people in public housing are of working age, not retired. I want to leave that concept here floating around the room. So, Mr. Cabrera, my question for you, since 80% of it is really distributed either through the formulas that go out to the public housing agencies or into the Section 8 program, you know, if we got your technology investment you wanted, we have fewer than 7,800 people working at HUD, you think?
I think you're going to have fewer than 7,800 people over time.
How would you see technology? What's your specific, I'm with the Public Housing Authority in Little Rock. One of their biggest complaints, and Ms. Glover may have a view on this as well, was just terrible back office IT support for their mission.
I think that's right. I think one of the problems is, look, whatever data essentially is used to report to you and to the American people is extremely uneven. Some very good. So one that comes to mind, one data pool that comes to mind that's very good is VMS data.
What does that mean?
VMS is Voucher Management System data, very picture month to month about utilization once the data is scrubbed. Why is that? Well, it's because over time we've put in tools in order to minimize the misuse, the fraudulent use of Section 8. And so we've become very, very good at looking at data back to Congress, how that's going. Mostly because Section 8's the big, you think about $19.7 billion, and at 9, it's a lot of money. But at the end of the day, what really means is that a lot of the other by the wayside. And one of the things, just who was in other parts of housing that I think would be a worthwhile endeavor would be, you know, what are the things that we want to know housing is used positively across. So if I'm thinking about someone who's elderly, what are the points of contact? how are kids being educated? Those are.
Mr. I appreciate the comment, Mr. Briggs, on rent, Mr. Husock as well. I think good point. What about individual savings accounts that are part of HUD's program? Did you use those and let people have that rent for the fixed rent and put money in savings, sort of saving money on payment assistance? That's part of the HUD. I wonder if you took advantage of it.
Well, we did, and we were able to more properly with the work regulation, because we were then able to partner with foundations and organizations to use the programs that HUD were able to in working with those types of accounts.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired.
Yields back. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the panel, joining us this afternoon and being here for a few hours to talk about HUD. I'd like to talk about an organization and get some feedback. The organization is called Hearth. It provides transitional housing services to victims of domestic violence on a continuum of care program. It's a great organization that's truly saving lives, and its mission houses women seeking shelter from abusive relationships. Earlier this year, they were told by Allegheny County that by serving only women, they were in violation of HUD guidelines and would lose funding. In a subsequent conference call, Hearth continues serving women if the county agreed. Unfortunately, Hearth has found itself at an impasse in its funding for the 2016 fiscal year resolution. Based on experience, your sense that HUD will allow agencies such as Hearth to serve subpopulations, including domestic violence victims?
I think that I'm speechless. HUD has adopted all the research valid for now a decade plus, and so right through its reauthorization. Women are a suspect classification constitutionally. I'm struggling to understand how that would be the determination. And on the other hand, as you well know, I'm not terribly surprised. And I think that that's one of the problems, and that is there's a rigidity to policy decision-making causes those kinds of results that really has to be revisited.
Seem fair that hard living, just women?
Unequivocally, no. But I mean, not knowing greater facts, not knowing if there's something else, some other dynamic that I'm unaware of, just the facts that you've portrayed to me, I'm struggling with that one.
Thank you. In your testimony, you argue that housing policy, services, and value to the taxpayer would improve if HUD encouraged more competition, not less. Can you give some examples of ways that the federal government can increase competition in the affordable housing sector?
The best example I know is the one I just was involved with. So in the case, for example, of a performance-based contract administration, that's a very large contract. It can be as high on occasion as $845 million contract. HUD went out and undertook a NOFA. And in that NOFA, HUD added rules that are not supported at law and that killed competition from one of the competitors most naturally to be a competitor, public housing authorities. And it culminated in a lawsuit. That lawsuit's been resolved. The plaintiffs, the public housing authorities and their instrumentalities, won that lawsuit. Thankfully, I was part of that team. And it's a great example of what HUD should not do. I think what happens is that there is this press to make a lot of people happy, and HUD, in so doing, makes no one happy. And I think that one of the things that HUD needs to do better, I think it's also in my testimony, is it needs to listen better in terms of what it's trying to accomplish and who can take them there within the context of the acts that govern HUD, in this case, the Housing Act of 1937, FGCAA, and SECA.
Mr. Husock, you've written extensively about the inherent flaws of HUD. In your testimony, you argue that at its core, HUD was predicated on a deeply pessimistic view about American society, that the new urban poor of the 1960s, the minority poor, would not be able to advance up the socioeconomic ladder as had their predecessors in poor city neighborhoods. As we look towards reforming HUD and improving the prospects of Americans who receive housing assistance, what are some of the programs or practices that follow from HUD's flawed, pessimistic foundation? In other words, how can we put HUD on a more optimistic footing?
Yeah, and that's why I've been trying to be constructive in my testimony, whatever doubts I may have had about the original wisdom. And I think that incentivizing work and self-improvement for those who are able-bodied and able to work, who are within housing, lies at the core. It would align our housing policy with our social policy as embodied by the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families Program and the Welfare Reform Act of 1995. I think incentivizing work and making sure that people have the supports they need, as Xavier Briggs and everybody on this panel has said, work incentives must be provided along with work supports, but incentivizing work and self-improvement, I think that would be the biggest change.
I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Poliquin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, very much. I appreciate the opportunity for you to schedule this terrifically, I should say, important hearing, and thank all the folks that are here to testify today. You know, is my opinion as a member of Congress that there are a handful of really important things that we do in the federal government, one of which is to protect our country and protect our citizens. National security is of paramount importance. Then we need to make sure we create the building blocks, the cornerstones for a stronger economy, one that grows, let the private sector grow, create jobs as you go along that path, such that folks have more opportunities in life and fatter paychecks and more freedom. I also think our federal government's in the business of compassion. We need to make sure that those who are unable to help themselves or those that need a hand up, that we help them. Now, I need to remind everybody in this room, because we talk about this on a regular basis, is that we are borrowing to pay our bills, and we're $18 trillion in a debt as a nation. $18 trillion. And the annual debt service payments, the interest payments today on that debt is about $230 billion a year, about twice what we spend in veterans benefits. So we're in one heck of a hole. Now, what that means to me as a member of Congress, and I'm sure to all of us public officials, is that we need to stretch every dollar as thin as we can, because it's a limited resource, and we are fiduciaries of taxpayer money. Now, when I was state treasurer up in Maine, I sat on our Public Housing Authority board, and they've been doing stuff the same way forever. I asked them a couple questions at a board meeting that seemed to stump them. Very simple questions. Number one, do we have a waiting list for families trying to come out of the cold? Now, Maine has long winters, and we have the oldest housing stock in the country. Do we have a waiting list? And there was no good answer, but we pieced it together the best we could. There was about 6,000 families in the state of Maine looking to get out of the cold. And I asked them another question. What's it cost? What's it cost to build these affordable apartments, these subsidized apartments? And you would have thought that I mentioned that the world was flat. They just didn't have an answer. The board didn't know. The folks in the front office sort of knew, but never told the board. Bottom line is, we were spending about $300,000 for one-bedroom apartments in Maine when the average price of a single-family home on a quarter acre with 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a garage was half that price. Now, where's the compassion? We're in a business of helping people. How in the dickens can you help people come out of the cold, put a warm roof above their head so they can raise their families, or elderly folks coming out of the cold, when you're spending twice what you should be, I would argue 2 or 3 times what you should do on public housing? Let's make that dollar stretch. Now, we changed the rules up in Maine. And we gave developers incentives to drive down the cost of those units instead of just artificially and continuously approving overruns, cost overruns. We said you don't need solar panels on the roof that never have a payback. And we drove down the cost of these units by about 35%. By the time I left, it was still going down, and we helped hundreds more people. That's the compassion that we need to do with limited resources in this country. So my question to you, Mr. Cabrera, because you've been in the development space, HUD is a big organization with a lot of moving parts. Do we have a room at HUD within this bureaucracy to drive down the cost of public housing so we can help more people?
So HUD doesn't build public housing.
But do we
And
have incentives for those that do, that we can use to help stretch that dollar?
much of what, you'd be stunned at what has been done thus far. That's what asset management was for. It was to basically drive down the cost centers at public housing authorities. If I had to guess, the housing authority that you were on the board of was probably using the low-income housing tax credit.
Somewhat, yes.
Right. And
As well as Section 8.
So if that's the case, that's less a public housing issue and it's more a development issue.
Do we have the data, Mr. Cabrera, to know what these units are costing us? Do we even have that data?
Yes, there's data, it's just not from the federal government. It depends upon where you are. You can wind up in places where the per unit cost is considerably less than $300,000. You can wind up in places where the per unit cost is more, but keeping in mind that those units generally serve people for 50 to 55 years.
Let's all be mindful that we have to stretch these dollars then to help as many people as we can. Thank you all very much.
Time of the gentleman has expired. There being no other members in the queue, I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. Thank you for your patience as well. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I would ask each of you to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. This hearing stands adjourned.